In part 1, I opened with a dark question. Would you kill a miserable old woman who extorted the poor in order to benefit thousands of lives? Well, let's say you went through with it, but the problem is there was someone who wasn't supposed to be there, a witness that you couldn't let live. And it turned out, while your constitution could handle the idea of killing the mean old hag, you weren't ready for the guilt of killing someone who didn't deserve it, even in your mind. And you left without the life-changing riches that you had planned on stealing. In part 2, we feel the deep discomfort of trying to inhabit the mind of someone racked with torment over not only what has happened, but with their disappointment at not being who they thought they were. How do you keep living with the guilt, with the crushing sense of failure? You have ruined your life, and you didn't even get the benefit from it that you were expecting to find. What now? Well, buckle in, because there's a lot more to cover before we get to the final resolution. I'm Jameson Olson, this is Becoming the Main Character, and today we are covering part 2 of 2 on Dostoevsky's psychological masterpiece, Crime and Punishment. Okay, before we get into the story, I just want to comment on something you'll notice pretty quickly when reading this book yourself, and it's Dostoevsky's unique way of writing dialogue, including internal monologues. The man didn't confine himself to what is considered proper grammar for literature. He was more concerned with trying to convey the flow and delivery of how the mind works, and it's given me the courage to admit something to you all. I am an ellipses addict. I use and abuse them. If you don't know it by name, an ellipses is the set of 3 periods used to convey a pause or a build-up to what is being said next. I never use em-dashes. I only use ellipses, and I've carried some shame over how I default to the obscure grammar fixture like it was my job. But after reading one of the greatest of all time, not be able to go a page without at least one of them, I no longer feel shame. Now, I am fully aware that this book was written in Russian, and for all I know, the ellipses doesn't exist in Russian grammar, but something about how he wrote it was translated by use of ellipses. But even if you take my favorite 3 dots out of the equation, my point still stands that Dostoevsky was more concerned with writing as close to the real way we speak than he was concerned about complete sentences. I actually saw something about this regarding Hollywood recently, of how if you look at the golden age of Hollywood back in the 40s and 50s, actors weren't really real. Many believe it had something to do with the idea of transitioning from the idea of stage acting, where dialogue was always a bit performative. And the video I saw actually pegged Marlon Brando as one of the first to ever play a real person on screen. This was a video from the account Nerdwriter, by the way. He makes sensational video essays about all sorts of topics from different forms of media. But the point is that whether it's a movie or a novel, the way the characters talk and act can either be perfect on the page, or it can be real to how erratic creatures like us behave. And Fyodor Dostoevsky chose to be loyal to the reality of how we think. Ellipses and all. Okay, let's dive back in. A quick refresher. Raskolnikov has just been accused point blank of murder by someone he has never seen before. He dragged himself back to his bed where he has collapsed in delirium. In the last 24 hours, he has contemplated suicide, returned to the scene of the crime. He has attempted to save Marmeladov from death and donated all of his money to the widow, leaving him to feel life for the first time and forever, which made him want to move past his guilt and shame for the murders. He was shaken out of that, however, the moment he saw his mom and sister, which was a brutal reminder that he was still too poor to save them from the cursed union to that idiot Pyotr Petrovich. He had spent the last bit before being accused of murder engaged in intellectual warfare with Porfiry Petrovich, the investigator in charge of the murders, where he defended an idea he had written about in an academic article about how extraordinary men have the right and duty to achieve their greatness, even if it involves them ending human lives in the process. Outside of our main character, Sonia was followed home by a mystery man to learn he is staying in the apartment next to hers. There's a meeting set up with the fiancé, Mr. Luzhin, where he has explicitly said he doesn't want Raskolnikov there, but Dunya has asked not only her brother, but his cute friend Razumihin, aka Raz, to join them, so we can't wait to see that blow up. Okay, I think that's everything. Let's pick up where we left off with Raskolnikov lying in fits on his sofa that he uses as his bed. But if you thought his emotions were purely about the fear of being caught, you'd be oversimplifying. He begins by berating himself for dropping the jewel case in the painted apartment, saying that might be a clue that would lead to his undoing. "You miss an infinitesimal line and you can build it into a pyramid of evidence," he said. He jokes that maybe a fly flew by the window and witnessed it. But from there, he begins to chew himself out for not being up to his own standard of an extraordinary man. And how dared I, knowing myself, knowing how I should be, take up an axe and shed blood? I ought to have known beforehand. Ah, but I did know. Those men, he says, are not made so. Quote, the real master to whom all is permitted storms Toulon, makes a massacre of Paris, forgets an army in Egypt, wastes 500,000 men in the Moscow expedition, and gets off with a jest at Vilna. Each of these is referencing Napoleon, who is kind of Raskolnikov's golden example of what an extraordinary man is throughout the book. This choice of events to mention is interesting because it shows the breadth and depth of Napoleon and what he did in terms of valuing or not valuing human life. Toulon is a battle where he made a name for himself. The massacre in Paris was where he killed many royalist supporter civilians by firing into a crowd, all in the name of preserving the revolutionary government. When he invaded Egypt, he left his army behind as he returned to France, condemning soldiers to death or surrender. It was shortly after this that he crowned himself emperor. And I've mentioned the Russia campaign in another episode where he was so convinced of his invulnerability that he led 500,000 men on an undersupplied crusade into Russia, which left him coming home with not even 10% of his original force. And the getting off with a jest at Vilna is just showing how after all these events, which there were many more, he was able to live with himself in spite of it all. Quote, and altars are set up to him after his death, Raskolnikov laments, which he believes is proof that literally all is permitted to the extraordinary man. Such people, it seems, are not of flesh but of bronze, he says. He laughs at how silly it is for him to think killing a helpless old pawnbroker could ever be tied to acts like someone like Napoleon. He then begins to rationalize his actions as a way to try and cope with the dissonance in his head. She was a mistake, perhaps, but she was only an illness of my mind. I didn't kill a human being, but a principle. I killed the principle. Then we get to the most honest thought we've heard out of him so far. Life only happens once. I'm not going to wait around for some abstract happiness of everyone. I want to live now or not at all. I couldn't walk past my mother starving while I clutched my last ruble, telling myself it was all for some good future. I told myself I was contributing my small brick to that future and that my conscience was clean. Ha! That's how you slit me through. I wanted to live just once. But the truth is simpler. I am nothing but a rationalized parasite. I proved it by explaining myself, by dressing the act up as noble, by pretending it was calculated and just. I chose the most useless person, telling myself I'd take only what I needed, and I imagined the rest going to good causes. All lies. The real proof is this. I knew beforehand that after killing her, I would despise myself even more, and I was right. I'm lower, meaner, more contemptible than the woman I killed. That's the real horror. Not the blood, but the cheapness of it all. I understand the conquerors now, the ones who kill without explanation and never look back. They act and the world bends. That kind of man is consistent. I am not. And that's what I can never forgive. Consider this for a bit. He had just spent probably an hour with Porfiry, the actual policeman who might be able to condemn him, and he was confident in his intellectual sparring, but having a total stranger who he has no context on point blank accuse him of killing the woman has sent him into a spiral. Raskolnikov falls asleep from exhaustion only to have the weirdest and worst dream ever. He dreams he's led back to the pawnbroker's flat once more, but she is there again. He's actually reliving the day of the murder. He finds himself involuntarily pulling the axe from the noose in his jacket, raising it above his head and bringing it down on her head. But this time, she doesn't collapse. There's no blood. In fact, she starts laughing at him. And he could hear laughter from the other side of the curtain in her bedroom. He began to swing the axe more, but it just led to more laughter. He runs away, but there are people in the hallway and on the stairs, all of them huddled together, whispering, but looking at him in suspicion. He is trying to scream at the moment when he finally wakes up. But when he wakes up, there was a strange man standing in the doorway. Is this a dream? He asked himself. He pretended to be asleep so he didn't have to interact with the man, but the man, with the hint of a smile on his face, stepped into the room and walked up to the small table, eyes never leaving Rodion's face. The man sat on the chair, just smiling patiently as if he was not going to speak until Rodion finally asked him what he wanted. He waited 10 minutes until Raskolnikov finally spoke. "Ha! I knew you were not asleep," he said with a chuckle. Then the well-dressed, middle-aged man responded, Allow me to introduce myself. I am Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov. Now, if you're trying to place that name, Svidrigailov is the man who temporarily ruined Dunya's life because of his conceived passions for her. The fact that he would show up to the girl's brother's place unannounced and with a smile on his face just shows how confident and possibly conniving he is as a person. He shamelessly says he has come here asking for Raskolnikov's help with a matter concerning his sister. Rodion, of course, immediately rejects any notion of helping the man. But Svidrigailov is unfazed at this and opens by saying he barely feels the need to explain his actions in his own home. That he is a man susceptible to falling in love, which he claims is not a matter of choice or willpower. And once you accept that, everything else that happened can be understood. Am I a monster, or am I myself a victim? Reason is the slave of passion, you know. I did the most harm to myself in the matter. And what about Marfa Petrovna? Raskolnikov asked. Oh, I forgot to mention this happened. At some point, we learned that Marfa Petrovna has died. We'll learn a little bit more about it later, so I'm not going to spoil that, but all we have heard is that she is no longer with us. And so the fact that her husband has come to Petersburg raises even more questions. At the mention of his dead wife, Svidrigailov's countenance changed slightly, not looking guilty or shaken, but just a little somber at the mention of Marfa. He says his conscience is clear in the matter. The medical examination came back saying it was due to her taking a bath right after a heavy dinner with a bottle of wine. Now, obviously, the idea of dying from taking a bath after a big meal and a drink is totally bunk by today's standards, but the fact that this cause was believable enough back then speaks to what I've said in past episodes that try to deal in science or medicine, that we were really just dumb back then as a species, but we were trying our hardest to figure things out, and you have to give him credit for that. Raskolnikov considered walking out of his own room to end this conversation, but suddenly there was a curiosity that he needed to resolve. He needed to get a better sense of a man who could act this way and feel no shame about it. Not saying that he thought Svidrigailov might be an extraordinary man, and yet here he was showing the ability to act without remorse, the very thing Rodion had been chastising himself for not being able to do. They have a few more exchanges, Svidrigailov telling his side of things regarding his relationship with his dead wife, who, we learn, married him to save him from a life as a bad gambler in debtor's prison. Their relationship wasn't particularly based on love, but it did suit them both for the years that it lasted. She kept him in line, he provided her with a man that was content to let her, the one with all the money, be the leader of the household. He was content to just live an elegant lifestyle on her dime. He mentions that he's been visited by her ghost on multiple occasions. It's just a lot in this conversation, but Raskolnikov listens to all this in gross fascination. What a curious specimen. Svidrigailov seemed to act hyper-aware of how others perceived him, and yet his actions were more aligned with someone who is totally aloof. Eventually, the topic came around to what it was he had been hoping to get Raskolnikov's help with regarding Dunya. It comes out that he knows of Dunya's engagement to Luzhin, and he claims that he doesn't detest the man as much as Rodion seems to, but he does dislike him enough that he feels guilty for the fact that his own dead wife, Marfa Petrovna, basically arranged their marriage, and out of penance for his guilt, he wants to free Dunya from feeling she needs to marry this man by gifting her 10,000 rubles. He seems quite certain that she won't go through with the marriage if she has this much money. "You're insane!" Rodion cried out. "I have no need for the money. If she doesn't accept it, I will only waste it in some more foolish way," he said. "I make the offer with no ulterior motive. I only wish to help your sister, who I caused a fair amount of trouble to previously. If there were a millionth fraction of self-interest in my offer, I wouldn't have made it so openly. She is taking money just the same if she marries Luzhin, but this way, she's not obliged to unite with a man she doesn't care about." Raskolnikov is bewildered, but he tells the man he's certain his sister won't take the money. "That is why I'm asking you to convince her to take it." "I won't do it." "Well, then I will have to find a way to see her myself, and we both know that seeing me will only cause her more distress." But he does express how he would like to see her one last time, to which Rodion said he shouldn't plan on it. "You don't really know me, though, do you, Rodion Romanovitch? I think we may become better friends." "You think we could be friends?" Svidrigailov goes on to say a bunch of things that just inflate his own image of how much he thinks he is worth having as a friend, but then he says he needs to leave and just asks him to relay the message to Dunya. And almost as an afterthought, he tells Rodion that regardless of accepting his 10,000 rubles, Marfa Petrovna has left 3,000 to Dunya in her will that are coming her way no matter what. As Svidrigailov went down the stairs, he bumped into Razumihin in this doorway, and Raz had stopped by to collect his friend on their way to this meeting with Pyotr Petrovich Luzhin that was scheduled. Rodion relayed the visit from the old gentleman on their way, saying he's not sure why he feels so off about the man, but the fact that he'd picked up and come to Petersburg almost immediately after his wife's death did not sit well with him. They arrived at the meeting place where Mother and Dunya were waiting, and they all wait anxiously for the arrival of Luzhin to see how he would react to the blatant disregard of his request. He didn't say anything or react openly at the first sight of Raskolnikov, although he did stiffen up when he saw the young man. After he sat, there was an awkward silence for a time. We jump inside Luzhin's brain for a brief moment to learn that he sat in silence, considering just leaving without a word, hoping that would get his point across. But he also hated uncertainty, and if his request was being so blatantly disregarded, he wanted an explanation. He began asking the ladies about their trip. They talked about how tiring the journey had been, but Mama Pulcheria said if it hadn't been for the wonderful aid of Mr. Dmitry Prokofitch Razumihin, and she gestured to him as he said his name, it would have been a most unpleasant arrival. Pyotr Petrovich sneered out a half-smile, saying he'd had the pleasure of meeting with the young man the day before. Quote, Pyotr Petrovich belonged to that class of persons on the surface very polite in society who make a great point of punctiliousness, but who directly they are crossed in anything are completely disconcerted and become more like sacks of flour than elegant and lively men of society. Punctilious means someone who is obsessed with correctness and formality. So this is basically saying he is capable of putting on a front as long as it's part of the game of politeness. But as soon as he's thrown into a circumstance where things don't go as he expects them to, he doesn't really know how to act. Luzhin brings up the death of his relative, Marfa Petrovna, saying that he'd heard that Arkady Svidrigailov had up and come to Petersburg, which he thinks is suspicious coming so quickly after his wife's funeral. He hints at rumors about how Svidrigailov might have been involved in his wife's passing, which shocks the two ladies present. He is a most depraved and abjectly vicious specimen. He proceeded to slander the man further, with more stories of him being abusive and mean-hearted. Dunya expressed her doubt at some of the stories, and her fiancé was quick to claim she seemed to be defending the man. All that she knew, in her words, was that outside of his inappropriate professions of love to her, he seemed to be level-headed and of a pleasant demeanor. Ah, Luzhin said, he'll end up right back in the debtor's prison that Marfa Petrovna pulled him from. Raskolnikov decided he was done listening to the windbag Pyotr Petrovich and said how he'd just been visited by Svidrigailov. Everyone exclaimed in disbelief. He asked me to set up an interview with you, Dunya. He has a proposition for you. He also said Marfa left you 3,000 rubles in her will. Mama Pulcheria was busy thanking God for this miracle, but Dunya had questions. What is his proposition? Did he tell you? Yes, he did. Well, what of it? I'll tell you afterward, he said, taking a sip from his tea, but it was clear he was dangling this in front of Pyotr Petrovich to make him angry. The pompous man took this as his cue to leave so he could stop being insulted by this scenario. I have a business engagement, so I will not be in your way, he said. Dunya asked him to stay, claiming he'd said he would spend the entire evening with them. He sat down again briefly, looking down as if deciding what to say. He then stared at his fiancée and opened up more than he was used to doing socially. I certainly expected to spend the evening with you and your honorable mother, but since your brother cannot speak openly in front of me, I also do not wish to speak openly of the important matters I have. Also, I am displeased that my urgent request has been completely disregarded. He then fell back into silence. Dunya, sitting up a little more, spoke clearly, saying he was only there because she insisted that he be. You claim he insulted you, so I wanted to get to the bottom of it. If Rodia really did insult you, I wanted him to apologize. Luzhin leaned in so he could whisper harshly, There are certain insults which no goodwill can make us forget. Dunya asked him to behave like the reasonable man she believed him to be, and outlines how both Rodion and himself have expressed to her that they will not be around the other, and in choosing one, she loses the other. She only wanted to make an attempt at undoing the damage between the men. But Luzhin, disregarding the importance of familial relations, interpreted what she said to mean that she was putting the opinion of an insolent, uncouth, and impoverished youth at the same level of importance as his own, which he took even more offense at. Rodion just smiled sarcastically, watching this all unravel as he had suspected it would. Raz was fidgety, but was also hopeful at the idea that this relationship might implode right here and now. Love for the future partner of your life, for your husband, ought to outweigh your love for your brother, Luzhin pronounced sententiously. I didn't bother to look up what sententiously means. And in any case, I cannot be pulled on the same level. He trailed off at this. He then tried to get Mama Pulcheria to say that she had misrepresented his statements about marrying a poor girl in her letter to Rodion, which is why the two of them got off on the wrong foot. But she claimed she only expressed what she understood to be his opinion. At this point, the family was coming together in opposition of Luzhin. You like to claim you've been misrepresented, Raskolnikov said, building up to his sharp-tongued point. And then he chews the man out for the claim that had been made that he'd given money to a prostitute instead of a widow. Luzhin snapped back, saying he only spoke truth, that the young man throws away his money, and says the fact that he gave it to a family who had members of such ill repute should be bad enough, regardless of which member he gave it to directly. You and all your virtues aren't worth the little finger of that unfortunate girl who you throw stones at, Rodion said. Oh, would you go so far as to introduce her to your mother and sister, then? Raskolnikov smiled smugly, knowing this would set off the proper man. I already have. His mother was scandalized that he had made this information public. His sister seemed embarrassed as well, but rather than express emotions of shock, Luzhin just used this as his closing argument to Dunya that she should not be so quick to weigh the idea of losing him on equal grounds to the idea of losing her brother. Dunya asked her fiancé to leave. Her face was white with anger. The man was stunned. He had too much confidence in himself, is how the book puts it. He had never considered this would be the outcome. If I go out this door, he said, pointing repeatedly, I will never come back. Who said I wanted you to come back? Dunya said defiantly. So that's how it stands, the apparently now ex-fiancé said as he stormed towards the door, making comments to the mother about how much money he was out in his assistance to getting them to Petersburg. Raskolnikov was ready to make good on his promise of throwing the man down the stairs, but his mother was now heated enough herself, saying that they were the ones who put more out in coming to him. They had moved on their own dime at his request and were put up in these less than desirable quarters because he was so eager to have them here, but not comfortably so. He stopped at the door and with a sharp breath made one last claim of how he thinks they forget how willingly he came into this arrangement despite the rumors of Dunya's reputation. But that now his eyes have been opened to how reckless of a choice that was. Raz jumped from his chair, claiming he will smash the man's head in if he doesn't leave. But almost uncharacteristically, Raskolnikov was calm as he walked up to stand face to face with the man, asking him to kindly leave without another word. Luzhin's face was steaming red with anger as he glared at Rodion in silence before turning and slamming the door behind him. Quote, and rarely has any man carried away in his heart such vindictive hatred as he felt against Raskolnikov. Him, and him alone, he blamed for everything. It is noteworthy that as he went downstairs, he still imagined that his case was perhaps not utterly lost and that, so far as the ladies were concerned, all might very well indeed be set right again. Luzhin stormed through the streets, ruminating on how his dream of a beautiful and devoted wife was being ripped from his grasp, and he determined that he may have said he was never coming back, but he was not actually going to give up on this dream that easily. He had to crush that conceited milksop of a brother, as he put it, who had caused it all. And back with the Raskolnikov family, Dunya and her mother were busy consoling each other. Dunya also apologized to her brother, saying she'd known the man had issues, but she had no idea just how base he was, and that if she had known, she never would have accepted his proposal. Raskolnikov was just relieved that everyone finally saw things his way, but they quickly turned to the visit from Svidrigailov, wanting to hear the details. He told them about the 10,000 and then recounted most of their entire conversation. He said how he initially told the man he wouldn't even relay the message, but changed his mind when Svidrigailov said if he didn't, he would find a way to deliver it himself. The women asked how the man seemed. He said that Svidrigailov had claimed no romantic feelings for Dunya anymore and that he just wanted to see her free of Luzhin. I must confess, said Rodion, I don't quite understand him. The man says he's not that rich, but he offers 10,000 rubles. He said he's going on a journey, and 10 minutes later he forgot he'd said anything about it. Then he told me he was getting fixed up to marry a girl here in Petersburg. No doubt he has motive, and probably a bad one, but his actions feel pretty clumsy for someone with designs against you. Dunya was silent. There was a worried look on her face. He has got some terrible plans, she said. Raz jumped in, saying he will track the man down and watch him, and if Dunya will give him leave, he won't let the man out of his sight. Dunya smiled and held out her hand to the kind offer, but she still looked worried. They talked for a time about what they could do with the 3,000 that Marfa had left Dunya. Razumihin was even more charming and was quickly winning over the newly single young woman, but eventually Rodion remembered what he'd planned on telling them here, something he'd wished to avoid. But in light of the net that seemed to be closing on him, think back to not only having to meet with Porfiry the next morning, but the fact that the stranger was calling him a murderer to his face, he felt the need to distance himself from his family. He tells them he must go, and that it's better if they don't see him for a time. He will come back to them when he's himself again. Just leave me alone for now, he asked. Pulcheria Alexandrovna cried out in dismay. Dunya and Raz looked shocked at his sudden statement. Dunya told him he was harming their mother, but he just kept muttering about how he'll come later when he's ready. His sister burst into tears, calling her brother a wicked, heartless egoist, and Razumihin tried once again to use the insanity plea to somehow make the women feel better. But Raskolnikov was already walking out the door, and his friend followed him. I knew you would run after me, he told Razumihin. Go back to be with them. I'll come when I can, if I can. Goodbye. Where are you going? What are you doing? What's the matter with you? His friend asked, completely perplexed. Rodion stopped, slightly annoyed at the questions. Never ask me about anything. I have nothing to tell you. Don't come see me. I'll come here. Maybe. Just leave me. But you don't leave them. Do you understand? The narrator notes that this moment would be burned in Razumihin's mind for the rest of his life. The look of fiery intent in his friend's eyes, but the coldness in his demeanor. The eyes pierced him until his mind began to race with ideas of what this all could be about, until one idea struck him, and he turned pale. Raskolnikov, taking this as realization on his friend's part, asked, Do you understand now? Go back, go to them, he said, and he turned and left. Raz went back inside and tried to console the women, claiming it was just his illness, that he was upset and shouldn't be irritated. But despite all the claims that their son and brother would return, the chapter ends with the narrator pointing out that, in fact, from that evening, Razumihin took his place with them as a son and a brother. Rodion went straight to the address that Sonia had given him. She was surprised to see him, but after the initial shock, she smiled. Her cheeks flushed and tears came down her face. She was happy to see him, but also kind of sick and ashamed that he was witnessing her world. Raskolnikov scanned the room. It was actually pretty large, but had a low ceiling and was very sparsely furnished. He noticed, quote, every sign of poverty, second-hand furniture, shabby wallpaper, no curtain on the bedstead. He apologized for his late visit. It was something like 11 p.m. at this point. But he says he may have to go away again soon and may never see her again. Will you not come to the funeral luncheon tomorrow? She asked nervously. I'll know by tomorrow morning, but, well, never mind that. He invited her to sit down, grabbing her by the hand and commenting on how thin and transparent her hand was, almost like a dead person's. Instead of being offended at the comment, she laughed, saying she's always been like that. Raskolnikov looked her in her humble eyes and told her that her father had told him all about her, including that night where she'd made the choice to sacrifice herself for the family. Sonia was confused, but Rodion was already asking her about her stepmother and siblings. Will they stay there? I don't know, she said sadly. They are in debt to the landlady. She wants them out. Katerina Ivanovna says she won't stay there long anyway. Raskolnikov shakes his head at how bold this destitute woman is. Sonia told him not to talk like that. She was even getting a little angry, but it's noted that her anger was only in the way that a canary or some other little bird might get angry. She says that her stepmother's mind is unhinged. She was already unbalanced before her father's death, but now she didn't have a way to cope with the bleak reality that faced her. She talked more about how grim things were financially for the family. She recounts a time not a week before her father's death when she, quote, was cruel to her stepmother. Rodion can't conceive of a way that this timid little person could be cruel to anyone, but she told a brief story of how one day a clothing peddler had come by and Katerina Ivanovna had spotted some collars that she fell in love with. She seemed enchanted with them and begged Sonia to gift them to her. But Sonia, who could only think of the fact that Katerina had nothing to wear with those collars, asked, "What use are they to you, Katerina Ivanovna?" She immediately regretted the words. Her stepmother looked hurt, not hurt at the loss of the collars, but hurt at the refusal. Sonia was in tears telling the story, but Raskolnikov had perked up only at the mention of the clothing peddler. It was Lizaveta. "Did you know Lizaveta?" he asked. "Yes. Did you know her?" But Rodion had already moved on from what his own question was and told Sonia that her stepmother will die soon from consumption. She grasped his hands. She obviously knew this was the case, but hearing it spoken out loud made her feel terrible. "What will you do with the children when she does die?" he asked. She looked desperate and through her tears said, "I don't know." "And even while she's alive, what would happen if you got sick and couldn't work?" She begged him to stop saying these things. She looked terrified. "They'll be on the streets," he said. "Oh no, God will not let it be," she said through her sobs. After thinking a moment, he states that most likely Polenka, who is the next oldest, that's like 11 years old, that she will end up with the same fate as Sonia. "No," she cried out. "No, it can't be. God would never allow something so awful to happen." "He allows it to happen to others," Rodion said coldly. "No," Sonia cried. "God will protect her." But perhaps there is no God at all. When he said this, Sonia's face changed. A tremor passed through before she broke into more uncontrollable sobbing. 5 minutes passed in silence. He still paced up and down the room in silence, not looking at her. At last, he went up to her, her eyes glittering with tears. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked straight into her face. His eyes were hard, feverish, and piercing. His lips were twitching. All at once, he bent down quickly and dropped to the ground, kissing her feet. Sonia drew back from him as from a madman, and certainly he did look like a madman. "What are you doing to me?" she muttered, turning pale, and a sudden anguish clutched at her heart. He stood up at once. "I did not bow down to you. I bowed down to all the suffering of humanity," he said. He got up and walked away to the window. "Listen," he added, turning to her a minute later. "I said just now to an insolent man that he was not worth your little finger and that I did my sister honor making her sit beside you." "You said that to them? And in her presence?" cried Sonia. "Sit down with me and honor? Why, I'm dishonorable. Why did you say that?" "It was not because of your dishonor and your sin I said that of you, but because of your great suffering. But you are a great sinner, that's true," he added almost solemnly, "and your worst sin is that you have destroyed and betrayed yourself for nothing. Isn't that fearful? Isn't it fearful that you are living in this filth which you loathe, and at the same time you know yourself, you've only to open your eyes, that you are not helping anyone by it, not saving anyone from anything? Tell me," he went on almost in a frenzy, "how this shame and degradation can exist in you side by side with other opposite holy feelings. It would be better, 1,000 times better and wiser, to leap into the water and end it all." In response to all of this, Sonia's only words were, "But what would become of them?" The face she had seemed unfazed that he had just basically recommended that she should kill herself, seemed to indicate that she had thought of it before. Raskolnikov could see it. He knew from the fact that she wasn't shocked at his words that they had been her own thoughts once. But if she had been tortured enough by this existence to consider it herself, why is she still here, he thought. And then, quote, only then he realized what those poor little orphan children and that half-crazy Katerina Ivanovna meant for Sonia. He was stunned. How? How could she go on living like this, hating her circumstances but refusing to take the easy way out and suffering day after day, all for the sake of other people? The book doesn't say this, but in my head I compare this to how he has only gone a few days since the murder and he is unable to be alone with his thoughts. So he is likely as appalled as he is impressed at this feat. How could she bear this burden? In psychological terms, I think the simple way to put this is she is living day to day with an enormous amount of cognitive dissonance. She knows and believes that what she does is a sin, and yet she is able to do it every day without collapsing mentally because she is doing it for someone other than herself. What was holding her up, Raskolnikov thought to himself? It couldn't be depravity. It seemed obvious that despite what she did to make her daily bread, she had not sunk to the level of enjoying or celebrating it. By his estimation, there are only 3 ways that her life can play out. The canal, meaning suicide, the madhouse, or she will one day sink into the depravity in order to turn her heart and mind to stone. He was most disturbed by the last option, but he finds himself returning to the question, how can she go on like this? Quote, does she expect a miracle? No doubt she does. Doesn't that all mean madness? This felt like the only solution in his mind. So you pray to God a great deal, he asked. After a pause, she said, what should I be without God? And what does God do for you, he asked, unable to believe that a woman living a life like hers could be so faithful. Her chest lifted and fell heavily several times before responding. At first, she told Raskolnikov to not ask such questions, that he doesn't deserve to, but she then trailed off. He does everything, she said timidly, looking down at the floor. So that is the way out, Raskolnikov thought to himself smugly, like he had just cracked a case. He stared at her thin, pale face with soft blue eyes. She may be physically small, but in that moment, when her faith was being questioned, she seemed fearsome and defiant. She's a religious maniac, he thought. He pointed at a Bible that was sitting on the top of a chest of drawers in her room and asked her where she got it. Lizaveta brought it to me, she said. The answer stunned him. With every detail he learned about her, she fascinated him more. He picked it up and began to flip its pages before asking her where the story of Lazarus was found. She didn't respond. She just kept staring at the ground in a sort of outraged fervor. Where is the raising of Lazarus, Sonia? Find it for me, he said, holding the book out towards her. You're not looking in the right place, she said, without looking at him. It's in the 4th Gospel. He set the book in front of her and told her to find it and read it to him. He then sat down before waiting for her response. He was muttering to himself. She moved slowly to the table where the book lay, almost distrustful. Was he only asking for this to be read so he could mock her further? Haven't you read it? She asked timidly. Long ago, when I was in school, he responded. Do you not hear it in church? She asked. I haven't gone in a long time. Do you go frequently? No, she whispered. She had that look of shame on her face as she said it. He smiled at this. She tells him she did go last week, however. There had been a requiem service. Who was it for, he asked. For Lizaveta. She was killed with an axe. Raskolnikov froze. His nerves strained, and his head began to feel dizzy. It seems you were good friends with this Lizaveta? Yes, she was good. She used to come, not often. She couldn't, well, we would read together and talk. She will see God. That last sentence sounded strange to his ears. This new development of the connection between his victim and this young prostitute felt strangely convenient. He shook off that feeling and told her to read the story. Sonia asked him what for, since he doesn't believe. You used to read to Lizaveta, now I want you to read to me, he asserted. Her hands shook, her voice faltered, but slowly Sonia began. Now, a certain man was sick named Lazarus of Bethany. Raskolnikov began to see why Sonia couldn't bring herself to read aloud, and the more he saw it, the more harshly he pressed her to do so. He understood how painful it was for her to expose what was most deeply her own. These feelings were her private treasure, guarded for years, perhaps since childhood. Through a life of misery, an unhappy father, a grief-stricken stepmother, starving children, and constant humiliation, and yet he knew, with certainty, that despite her fear, she felt a desperate need to read, to speak these words to him, whatever the cost. He saw it in her eyes and in the intensity of her emotion. She steadied herself, forcing down the tightness in her throat, and she continued to read from the Gospel of John. He listened in awe at the fluctuations in her voice. She had started so timid and fearful, but the more she read the story of a great miracle being performed, the more she took courage, the more clearly she pronounced the deeds of her Lord to the non-believer in her room, as if she hoped he too would marvel at the resurrection of the one who was once dead. But after she finished, she immediately returned to her trembling state. The candle was flickering out in the dimly lit, poverty-stricken room where the murderer and the harlot sat in silence. 5 minutes or more passed. Finally, Raskolnikov told her he had come to her to speak of something, and he tells her how he had abandoned his family that day. Sonia, shocked, asked why he had done so. I only have you now, he said. Let us go together. We are both accursed. Let us go our way together. Sonia watched his eyes glittering as he said this. He spoke with the eerie confidence of a madman. Go where? She asked. I don't know. I only know we have the same road to travel. She understood nothing, but she could see the depth of his unhappiness on his face. No one else can understand you if you tell them, but I have understood. I need you. That is why I have come. She stated that she had no idea what he meant. He tells her she will later, but asserts that both of them have transgressed. Both of them have destroyed their own lives. Sonia was becoming very agitated by his words. What is this all for? She pleaded. What's it for? He said with a laugh. Because you can't remain like this. That's why. You have to face your reality and stop weeping like a child that God won't allow it. He reiterates his claim that her step-siblings will not be saved once their mother is dead or in a madhouse. What is to be done? She begged him. All there is to do is to break what must be broken once and for all, he said. Take that suffering on oneself. That is my parting word. It may be the last thing you ever hear from me. If I don't come tomorrow, remember these words. And someday, maybe years from now, you'll know what they meant. If I do come tomorrow, I will tell you who killed Lizaveta. Goodbye. She started at that last sentence. You know who killed her? Raskolnikov was walking out the door as he said he did, and he will tell her, but only her. I'm not coming to you to ask forgiveness, but simply to tell you. He closed the door behind him, leaving the young woman alone, and now frightened in the wake of his mad behavior. How miserably unhappy he must be, she thought. In that visit, he'd told her he'd abandoned his family, he'd said how he knew who'd killed Lizaveta, he'd kissed her feet, he'd even said he couldn't live without her. How miserable he must be. She didn't sleep. She was feverish and delirious from the encounter, not just thinking of Raskolnikov, but because of his harsh words. She couldn't help but worry for the future of Polenka and her siblings. But next to Sonia's room was an empty apartment, long marked for rent. She was used to it being vacant. But what she didn't know was that Svidrigailov had been standing there, listening through the door. When Rodion left, he paused and then quietly crossed to his adjoining room. He returned with a chair, set it silently by the door to Sonia's room. That conversation had intrigued him, so much so that he decided it would be worth listening again, and next time he wanted to be comfortable. After a poor night's sleep, Raskolnikov set out a little before 11 to meet with his impending fate. The reason he had been acting so rashly and so mysteriously to everyone was because he had this appointment with Porfiry Petrovich, the inspector. But this time, not some informal meeting in a random home, but at the police station. Would this be the end of it all? While waiting outside the office, Raskolnikov himself trembled a bit, trembling with fear of facing Porfiry Petrovich again. He hated the man with an intense, unmitigated gall and was afraid his hatred might betray him. So he forced himself to stop shaking and mentally prepare himself to go in with a cold and even arrogant bearing, determined to speak as little as possible. He was then summoned to the office, and Porfiry's office was plain but well furnished, nothing fancier than you'd expect in a government employee's office. As he entered, Porfiry was just coming into the room through another door, which he closed behind him. The inspector greeted him warmly. "Ah, my dear fellow, here you are in our domain. Come, sit." He gestured to a sofa in the room. Raskolnikov sat, looking at Porfiry suspiciously. He tells the inspector that he wrote out his declaration of ownership regarding the pledges and held out an envelope to Porfiry, who acted unsure what he was talking about for a second. "Ah, yes," he said finally, taking it and assuring him that was all he needed. "I believe you said yesterday you would like to question me, formally, about my acquaintance with the murdered woman?" In his mind, Raskolnikov was scrutinizing everything. Why did I say "I believe" at the beginning of that? And then his very next thought was, why should I be uneasy about having said "I believe"? He was quickly spiraling from the cool demeanor he was trying to put forward. His entire plan was falling apart just in the presence of the inspector. Yes, Porfiry said. "We have time. There's no hurry." He offered Raskolnikov a smoke. He himself seemed fairly agitated. He didn't sit at his desk, but paced behind it by the window. He mentioned how his actual home was being renovated, so his temporary quarters were here in the building, just through that door he'd come through. Raskolnikov acknowledged this, and they both fell silent. The awkwardness remained for long enough that Rodion decided to go on the offensive and ask if it wasn't the practice of investigators to try to put their suspects at ease, make it feel like they were just talking, and then once he was thoroughly disarmed, hit him with the fatal question. "It's in all the manuals, is it not?" he asked confidently. "Ha ha," Porfiry chuckled. "Yes, Is that why you imagine I mentioned my living arrangements? The inspector winked at him, full of good humor that still made Raskolnikov uneasy. Rodion tried to laugh, showing how at ease he wanted to seem, and Porfiry joined in the laughter, but suddenly Raskolnikov felt anger at the obvious cat-and-mouse game he was being subject to. He scowled at the inspector, who kept laughing. I came here because yesterday you told me you had some specific inquiries to make. If you do not intend to make them, allow me to leave. I am a busy man today. I have to attend the funeral of the man who was run over the other night. His anger rising as he kept rambling, feeling like he had been forced to dig himself out of a hole that Porfiry had pushed him into. He began to breathe heavily as he stood up and snapped, "In short, kindly examine me or let me go at once." Porfiry acted surprised at this. "Good heavens," he said, "what shall I question you about? There's no need for you to worry. I'm glad you came to see me, but I assure you I see you as nothing other than a visitor. I apologize if my laughter upset you. My nerves have made me subject to laughing fits. Please, do sit." After a pause, Rodion, who was still staring angrily at the inspector, sat down, but with his cap still in his hands. Porfiry apologized once more, saying he is a bachelor who doesn't get out very much, so he's not the best at conversation, but he assures the visitor he is very glad to have him here. Rodion fumed at this prolonged false friendliness. Does he really want to distract my attention with this silly babble, he thought? But Porfiry still didn't turn to business. He spoke of his need to go to the gymnasium more and other things, all the while Raskolnikov was attempting to control his breathing from riling him up further. He noticed that in Porfiry's pacings around the room, he had on multiple occasions paused at that door that the inspector had come through, as if listening for something. Is he expecting something? Rodion wondered. You are, of course, quite right about some of these elaborate psychological methods often used in interrogations, Porfiry continued. I find if you try to follow the forms too closely, they often end up useless. No, I find that if I believe someone to be a suspect, why should I worry him prematurely? If I have enough evidence, I will put him away. If I don't yet, very little point in letting him know that I suspect him. If I lock him up too soon, before I have enough concrete evidence, I am likely keeping myself from discovering the evidence that I would find if I just let him walk about for a few days more, free to incriminate himself further. If I leave one man quite alone, if I don't touch him and don't worry him, but let him know or at least suspect every moment that I know all about it and I'm watching him day and night, and if he is in continual suspicion and terror, he'll be bound to lose his head. He'll come of himself, or maybe do something which will make it as plain as twice 2 are 4. It's delightful. It may be so simple with a peasant, but with one of our sort, an intelligent man cultivated on a certain side, it's a dead certainty. So I let him walk about for a bit. He won't escape me. I know well enough that I've caught him. It's not just that he has nowhere to run. He is psychologically unable to escape me. More a law of nature than of man. Like a butterfly circles around a candle, he will continue to circle around me. Freedom will lose its attractions to him. So I let him sit, where he will get into a worse and worse mental state, which will in all likelihood provide me with even more concrete evidence than I need to put him away. Don't you believe me? The blood had drained from Rodion's face, but he still stared somewhat defiantly at the inspector. This is beyond cat and mouse, he thought. He would not be mocking me so openly like this if he didn't actually have some greater evidence than what he is waiting to present. He's too clever for that. But then he considered how maybe the most clever thing Porfiry could do would be to try and make him think he had enough proof to get a confession out of him prematurely. All he needed to do was make him lose his head. Ah, but you are wrong, Porfiry Petrovitch. No, my friend, no trap you lay will catch me as its prey. Let's see what you have in store for me, he thought. So Raskolnikov braced himself to face whatever terrible tricks Porfiry may have, but short of undeniable proof, he would not buckle. Porfiry brings the topic back to their discussion the previous day about the extraordinary man, or the special case as he calls him, and how such a man will be a very good liar in the cleverest fashion. You would think he will triumph at the fruits of his wit, but at the most interesting, most flagrant moment, he will faint. Maybe he was sick, and that is his explanation. But the point is, he may be an incredible liar, but he did not factor in his temperament. That is what betrays him. His wit may carry him away to the point of making fun of the man who suspects him, or he may turn pale at the wrong moment. Sure, he may deceive the questioner at first, but the odd things he says and does due to his temperament will be enough to make the questioner realize later, as he ponders the interaction in his head. Oh, he will definitely have given him the idea. The temperament reflects everything like a mirror. That is how the cleverest man, the psychologist, the literary man, can give himself away. But I do say, why do you look so pale, Rodion Romanovitch? Is it stuffy in here? Do I need to open a window? Raskolnikov tried to appear pleasant and natural even as his insides raged. He couldn't put up with this much longer. Oh, please, don't trouble yourself on my behalf, he said as he stood up once more. Porfiry Petrovitch, it is clear that you do actually suspect me of murdering those women. Let me tell you for my part that I am sick of this. If you find you have a right to legally prosecute me, arrest me. But I will not let myself be jeered at to my face like this. He was nervous what would come from this declaration. Would Porfiry let him go, or pull out a condemning piece of evidence that he'd been holding on to? I won't allow it, he said more angrily. Do you hear that? I won't allow it. Porfiry still played innocent to it all, claiming he didn't know what the young man meant, even going as far as to ask what was the matter with him. I won't allow it, Raskolnikov shouted loudly this time. Hush, Porfiry said, gesturing him to keep his voice down, saying that if he doesn't keep it down, others will come in, and what will they tell them? Raskolnikov repeated more quietly, but somewhat mechanically, like he was defaulted into a state of repetition. I won't allow it. I won't allow it. Porfiry ran to open the window, saying some fresh air will do him good. Come, have a drink, he said. You are ill. Porfiry's alarm and sympathy felt so natural that Raskolnikov almost believed it for a moment. Rodion Romanovitch, you will drive yourself out of your mind, he said as he pushed a glass of water into his hands. Your illness has not fully recovered. You must take better care of yourself. The inspector says how Razumihin had explained the illness in detail and that he knew that Rodion's mental state could not be held accountable for certain actions, say like when he had shown up at the murdered woman's apartment asking about the blood. You'll drive yourself mad thinking like that, my boy. Raskolnikov finally sat back down, less from wanting to continue this engagement and more from the exhaustion he was feeling. He still burned with anger, though, at this charade that Porfiry was masterfully playing. His mentioning that visit to the apartment so casually had almost made him buckle at his knees. Almost as a warning, he tells Raskolnikov a story of a man who, in a state of hallucination, confessed to a murder he hadn't committed. The man had been part of a circumstance that eventually gave the real killer their opportunity, but the guilt of the man's tiny part in the matter drove him insane until he convinced himself he was the murderer. The case made it all the way to the High Court of Appeals before he was sentenced to medical care rather than prison. You have to be more careful, lad, he said cautiously. Raskolnikov's head was spinning. Is it possible? Is it possible he is still lying? That all of this is a play he is performing? It can't be. Can it? Being turned around like this brought the fury back to Raskolnikov's heart, and he finally said he was not delirious when he visited the apartment, that he knew what he was doing. Yes, of course, Porfiry said. You have already claimed you were not delirious. But if you were truly mixed up in this crime, would you be so emphatic to prove to me that you were of a sound mind when you did such a thing? Quite impossible in my thinking. If you were burdened by anything in your consciousness, you would certainly insist that you were delirious. Isn't that right? Even this question stunk of slyness from the inspector. A chill went down Rodion's spine as Porfiry bent over so his face was a foot away from his own. You keep telling lies, Raskolnikov said slowly as a twisted smile came over his face. You are trying again to show that you know all my game, that you know all I shall say beforehand. You want to frighten me or to laugh at my expense. You are lying. I know that the best policy for a criminal is to tell the truth as closely as possible, to conceal nothing unless absolutely necessary. I don't believe you. What a wily person you are, Porfiry chuckled. There's no catching you. You are a perfect monomania. So you don't believe me? Well, soon enough you will. I have a sincere liking for you and genuinely wish your good. Raskolnikov's lips trembled at this. Yes, Porfiry said smugly, I do. You must take care of your illness, my dear boy. You think I suspect you? But why then would I so casually mention? I knew you were at the flat asking about the blood. That would have been a knockout blow if I'd used it as such, to make you feel comfortable right before drilling into you with questions about why you were at the murdered woman's flat at 10 p.m. the other night, asking about blood, and why did you invite the porters to go with you to the police station. That's how I should have acted if I had any suspicion of you. Raskolnikov seethed at Porfiry. You are lying. I don't know what game you're playing, but you are lying. Porfiry chuckled sarcastically, acting offended. I am lying? After a little bit of laughter, he said, I am lying. Look at how I just treated you, like your defender, not your investigator. I fed you excuses, illness, delirium, melancholy, even the incompetence of the police, all of it ready-made. But those excuses are slippery. Illness and delirium might explain confusion, but why those thoughts? Why those fears and not others? If it was all madness, then why did your madness know exactly where to go? Raskolnikov shot a fiery glare at the inspector and demanded to know in plain language if he suspects him or not. Porfiry laughed again, saying, What a business I'm having with you. Why are you so uneasy? I repeat that I will not put up with this treatment. With what? Porfiry cut in. Uncertainty? I won't have it. I cannot and will not, Raskolnikov said once again, starting to shout. Porfiry again urged him to stay quiet or others will come into the room and things could get messy. Feeling frenzied still, but also compliant, Raskolnikov dropped to a whisper, saying he will not allow himself to be tortured. Arrest me, search me, but kindly act in due form and don't play with me. Don't worry about the form, Porfiry said, almost gloating. I invited you here to see me in a friendly way. If I were to leave now, will you say you mean to arrest me? He started for the door, and Porfiry finally went to make his move. And don't you want to see my little surprise? It's sitting there behind the door, he chuckled, pointing to the doorway that Raskolnikov had seen the inspector come out of. What is it? Raskolnikov walked over and tugged on the door handle, but it was locked. Here's the key, Porfiry said cheerfully, extending his hand to the paranoid young man. You're lying, you damned Punchinello. He was like a wild animal in his reactions to Porfiry. You treat me this way to get me to betray myself to you, he snarled. Porfiry, who had started to back away in fear of a violent escalation, assured his guest that at this point, he could not betray himself further. You knew I was ill and tried to work me into a frenzy to make me betray myself. Produce your facts, he demanded. You have no evidence. Your only suspicions came from Zametov. You knew my character and thought you could drive me into a fury and then knock me down with priests and deputies. Well, where are they? Produce them! Porfiry listened to the sounds of several men loudly coming to the door of his study, and Raskolnikov jeered at the inspector. Ah, they're coming. You have sent for them. Well, produce them all. Deputies, witnesses, what you like, I am ready. But at that moment, something happened that neither Rodion Romanovitch or Porfiry Petrovitch could have possibly imagined that would be the end of their encounter. Okay, before we get to that, one tiny little nugget of great interest to me. Turns out Crime and Punishment isn't the cleanest translation of the title in Russian. The word prestuplenia gets translated to crime here, but actually is much better suited by saying crossing over. A word that in meaning is very related to the Latin word we have modernized as transgression, which also means moving across. Think progression moving forward, regression moving backward, transgression moving across. Now that title is interesting to note because suddenly the real meat of the story's focus seems to be pulled from being a legal matter like we assume it is when the title is Crime and Punishment, and suddenly it feels more like exploring the threat of Raskolnikov's theory of the extraordinary man. One possible title that would be more accurate in English would be The Consequences of Crossing the Line. The book is a study not in how the legal system works, but what happens both naturally, socially, and yes, legally, when you overstep a moral boundary because you believed yourself to be above it. It's such a tiny detail, but it makes a world of difference how we perceive this book. The scene happened so fast that Raskolnikov almost struggled to piece together what happened afterwards. The noise on the other side of the door grew louder, and it opened slightly. Porfiry, looking angry for the first time all day, barked that he had given orders to not be disturbed. But before he could receive an answer, the crowd had pushed through the door, and one of the officers stated that the prisoner Nikolai had been brought. I don't want him here, Porfiry shouted. Take him away! The officer stammered, and there was a physical tumult from the back of the group before someone pushed their way to the front. The man's face was deathly pale, but his eyes set in a grim determination. He was dressed like a workman. This was Nikolai, the painter. "You haven't been sent for," Porfiry shouted angrily. Nikolai, disregarding the statement, knelt on the floor. Porfiry demanded to know what was the matter. "I am guilty," Nikolai said pleadingly, looking to the heavens. "I am the murderer." No one in that room made a sound for 10 seconds. "What?" Porfiry finally spat out. "I am the murderer," Nikolai said again. "What? You? Whom did you?" Petrovich was dumbfounded. "I killed Alyona Ivanovna and her sister Lizaveta. I killed them with an axe. Darkness came over me." He was sobbing as he said this. Porfiry stood there contemplating this new information. He looked at Raskolnikov, who was standing in the corner of the room looking wildly at Nikolai. Porfiry went over to Nikolai and said, "I didn't ask you what came over you. Did you kill them?" Nikolai sobbed himself into a puddle as he squirmed out details to give evidence of his crime. "I did it with an axe." "Did you do it alone?" he was asked. "Yes, alone. Mitka," which is his brother's name, "is not guilty and shared no part in it." "How did you run after him when the porters saw you then?" "I did it to put them off the scent," he said. Porfiry looked irritated. "This is not his own tale he's telling," he muttered to himself. His eyes once again darted to Raskolnikov. "My dear Rodion Romanovitch, I'm afraid this won't do. You'll need to leave. You can imagine what a surprise this has been. Goodbye." "So you weren't expecting this?" Raskolnikov asked. "I dare say you weren't expecting it either," the inspector said as he took Raskolnikov by the arm and led him to the door. "But your little surprise, are you going to show it to me?" Raskolnikov said, his arrogance already returning in the form of sarcasm. "Until next time," Porfiry said. "I believe we can say goodbye," Rodion shot back. "That is in God's hands," the inspector said as he shut the door behind him. Raskolnikov walked straight home, completely bewildered, like a man who had gone as far as to have the noose put around his neck, only to be pardoned at the last second. What could explain this confession from Nikolai? He was not naive enough to believe the confession would stand 100%. He had to believe they would get Nikolai to retract his statement, and then Porfiry would be after him again. But for this moment, at least, he was free to do something for himself before the danger closed in once more. He couldn't help but wonder how that meeting would have ended if not for the interruption from the distressed painter. What would have been the little surprise? He sat on his sofa, elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands, until briefly a feeling of joy swept over him, and he suddenly realized he could still make the memorial dinner for Marmeladov, even though he had missed the funeral at that point. So he grabbed his cap and headed for the door. But as he reached for the door, it opened on its own. Rodion froze as in stepped the mystery man who had accused him of being a murderer the day before. He looked the same. The only difference was the look on the man's face. He seemed dejected and penitent, as opposed to his righteous anger from the day before. "What do you want?" Raskolnikov asked, half terrified, half angry. The man stood silently for a time before bowing deeply in front of Rodion. "What is it?" he asked, deeply uncomfortable with this scene. "I have sinned," the man said softly. "What do you mean?" "I have had evil thoughts." He then relays the story of how he, a stranger, had come to accuse Raskolnikov of murder. He said he had been outside of the murdered woman's home that night when Raskolnikov had visited, and he had come down to the porters, inviting them to take him to the station. This man had been so vexed that they let this very suspicious person off with nothing but an accusation of being a drunk. The artisan admits that he couldn't sleep. He remembered how Raskolnikov had spat out his address in his mad state and decided that he would come and check in on himself. Rodion suddenly remembered there had been a crowd at that scene where he had told the porters to go to the station with him. He did not recall this specific face of the speaker, but he did almost recognize the man's voice as the one who had yelled for the porters to take the man straight to prison. So that was all he had? No concrete evidence? But this man was so vexed at the easy treatment he had gotten that he had tracked him down to his address and accused him of the crime to his face. Rodion sighed heavily, realizing he had almost lost himself to a man who had nothing but an angry suspicion, and how Porfiry, too, had almost cracked him with nothing but psychology. "Was it you who told Porfiry I had been there that night?" he asked. The man looked at the ground as he confessed that he had shown up at Porfiry's minutes before Raskolnikov had gotten there, and that he was the surprise locked in the next room. He'd heard everything. He was ashamed at how awfully Porfiry had treated Rodion, only to learn that the painter had done it. He claimed that when he had told the inspector about the incident, that Porfiry had begun skipping around the room, punching his chest in delight, and that after a secretary had come in to announce that Rodion was waiting outside, the inspector pushed the man into the next room and told him to be quiet. Porfiry had come back and let him out as soon as Raskolnikov was gone from the station after Nikolai's confession, and the man went silent once more, bowing again. "Forgive me my evil thoughts and my slander." "May God forgive you," Rodion said in reply. The man left and Raskolnikov laughed. "It does cut both ways," he said, leaving his home, now more confident than ever. "Now we'll make a fight of it," he said, and with a malicious smile on his face, he went downstairs towards the funeral meal of Marmeladov. Okay, the next few chapters are about the only stretch in the rest of the book that I feel I can summarize pretty succinctly, because Rodion is not much of a character for most of it. To start us off, we go back to Peter Petrovich Luzhin, who is still harboring a lot of hatred in his heart towards Raskolnikov. And he is eager to find a way to bring Rodion to his knees. Luzhin was staying with a friend of his, Andrei Lebeziatnikov, who, this is the name we've heard referenced several times, and I guess now is as good of a time as any to finally point out where we first heard it. This is the man that Marmeladov said beat his wife in the second chapter of the book. Until now, we know nothing about him except that he beat Katerina Ivanovna, but it turns out Andrei's room was in the same house as where Marmeladov had been living. Obviously not as poor of an arrangement, but the same building. And his guest, Luzhin, was secretly delighted to learn that Katerina Ivanovna had been inviting every lodger in the building to the funeral meal. And he was even more delighted to learn that Rodion was also expected. We get a very detailed description of Lebeziatnikov, but I don't think it's worth getting to know him more than to say he's got some Razumihin vibes, in the sense of being a younger man whose head is full of ideas that he knows how to change society, but he's just less likable of a person at this point. Luzhin used his roommate, who knew the family of Marmeladov, to arrange for him to bring Sonia to their room. The funeral meal was about to start, and she was uncertain why she was here and acted very shy. Luzhin treated her very politely and casually asked if Raskolnikov had arrived yet. She confirmed that he had just come. "Why?" she asked. There is a long exchange where Luzhin pretends that he feels great sympathy for the situation that Katerina and her children are in, as well as Sonia, for that matter, and says he wants to be of small assistance. But he says he's worried about the mental state of Katerina Ivanovna, and so he'd rather give the money directly to Sonia, where he knows it will be used to help the little ones. He then hands over a crisp 10-ruble note. She took it, reluctantly grateful for the charity, and then left to return to the meal. Lebeziatnikov, who had been in the corner of the room, commended his friend on his charity, saying he heard and saw everything. What an honorable action on the part of his friend. "You wanted to avoid the gratitude for your true charity. Well done," he said. Luzhin almost scowled at Lebeziatnikov in response to his praise, and they returned to their debating of the social issues that Lebeziatnikov is so eager to discuss. Now we are at the actual funeral meal. There's a large crowd of eager and hungry neighbors. Now, I'm not diving into this chapter because the focus is heavily on Katerina Ivanovna and the beginnings of her descent into madness, all in the name of keeping up appearances. There's even more focus on her later that we'll also just barely touch on because she's just a side character. But after the death of her husband, every interaction we see of her is a woman burdened by too much to bear. And that is only compounded by her pride, which demands that she not be seen looking weak or affected. It's tragic and kind of heartbreaking. The next account of her is the most devastating, but in this chapter, it's evidenced by the attention to detail on a meal that is of no consequence to anyone, really. But it took a chunk of the money that Rodion had given her to provide for her family. But she cannot be seen skimping on social traditions simply because she cannot afford them. On top of that, we see how irritated she gets with the casual behavior of some of the guests. Arguing with her landlady some more, she was simply delighted when Raskolnikov showed up, telling him she is grateful to him for accepting her hospitality. The entire scene is a descending spiral of high-strung behavior, aggressive rebukes of people she's upset with, and a desperate attempt to maintain the dignity of the officer's daughter that she had grown up as, despite her circumstances screaming that she is little more than a poverty-stricken widow of 3. Like I said, when you read this yourself, it's hard to visualize without feeling bad for her. But the chapter closes with Katerina and the landlady about to go to blows right when someone walks through the door. It was Peter Petrovich. And this is a chapter I could find myself giving in greater detail if I'm not careful, so I'm going to stick to the facts to keep the plot moving forward. He has shown up to accuse Sonia of stealing a 100-pound note from his room. Everyone is shocked, as you can imagine, and Raskolnikov practically had smoke coming out of his ears. Luzhin pretends to not be hostile at first, simply saying he noticed it was missing after Sonia had left his room and asked her if she knew where it was, and that if she returns it to him, the matter will end there. But if not, he will be compelled to take very serious measures to retrieve it, and she will only have herself to blame. Sonia could not find words. She took so long to respond that Luzhin pushed her to say something. She claimed to know nothing about it. He elaborates the details, explaining how much money he had sitting out on the table when she'd come to see him. He tells a detailed version of the entire encounter between them to make it seem like a credible story, and then he says that the only other person in the room was his friend Lebeziatnikov, who is above suspicion and can corroborate his story. Of course, he made a point of telling everyone how he generously had given her 10 rubles, emphasizing how he knows it's uncouth to make such a public accusation, but that such black ingratitude for this generous gift should not be handled lightly. Sonia, unable to defend herself with words, simply pulled out the 10-ruble note and handed it back to him, begging him to take it, saying she has nothing else. He pressed her further, asking if she is outright denying taking the 100-ruble note, saying he had his friend Lebeziatnikov as a witness. She shuddered and shook her head as tears fell from her eyes. Katerina Ivanovna came to the defense of her stepdaughter and suggested that she empty her pockets as proof. She would not have such an ugly accusation hanging over Sonia's head. When Sonia didn't move, Katerina snatched both of the pockets from Sonia's dress and pulled them out. From the right pocket fell a piece of paper that tumbled its way through the air, landing at the feet of Luzhin. He bent over, picked it up between two fingers, and then held aloft a 100-ruble note that had been folded several times. The landlady broke the silence, yelling for the police. The crowd began to react loudly. Sonia froze, unable to speak or think. Rodion just watched silently. He knew something was up, but he couldn't peg what yet. Sonia finally found her voice, exclaiming that she did not take it. Her stepmother held her in her arms, saying she didn't believe it for a second. Once again, it was the woman's pride that caused her to act more than anything resembling love. It would simply be too much for her to have a thief in the family on top of everything. Luzhin quieted the crowd and put on a condescending tone as he said he would be merciful, that if poverty drove her to do it, he could understand, but why lie about it? Why refuse to confess and bring further disgrace on her head? Even now, he said, I am willing to look past this personal insult and only let this shame be the lesson to you. He looked at Raskolnikov as he said these words. The fire in Rodion's eyes was ready to burn Luzhin to the ground. The crowd was still mumbling and judging until one voice, unseen, yelled, "How vile!" Luzhin looked around uncertain. What vileness, the voice said again. It was Lebeziatnikov, who had just arrived in time to hear this play out. Luzhin went white when he saw the man in the room. Lebeziatnikov then proceeded to angrily chew the man out for daring to claim him a witness to such an ugly lie. The crowd was stunned. Luzhin looked very agitated. Lebeziatnikov then told everyone how he had witnessed Luzhin hand Sonia a 10-ruble note, but then he also saw him slip the 100-ruble note in the girl's pocket as he walked her to the door, but that he had assumed it was an attempt to be secretly charitable, not to accuse her of a crime. Luzhin tried to laugh it off, saying his friend was drunk. I never touched the stuff, Lebeziatnikov shot at him before continuing. He said I am a witness. Yes, indeed I am, but not to any wrongdoing by Sonia, only to the secret actions of himself. And to think I considered you a friend. The crowd seemed slightly unconvinced, so Lebeziatnikov turned to them and declared that he was positive it was a 100-ruble note he had seen Luzhin slip into her pocket, and that he would take an oath in front of any judge. Remember how after Sonia had left the room with Luzhin that Lebeziatnikov had said how he had heard and seen everything? The word saw was italicized, as if hinting to us that there was more to see than the surface interaction in that chapter. And now we know what it was. He had thought his friend was being a super good guy, giving essentially a couple months' worth of food and shelter to a poor family. Luzhin tried to act easy, saying this was just a pack of nonsense. But his roommate was calling for someone to get the police so he could make a statement. And in the commotion, Raskolnikov stepped forward and said he knew why Luzhin would risk such an action. He then explains to the whole room about Dunya and Luzhin's hatred for himself, and how the man was not above sinking to something devious to make him look bad, like associating with not only a harlot, but a thief, in hopes of making his own mother and sister turn on him to ensure Luzhin's marriage. Lebeziatnikov corroborated this, saying that the moment Sonia had entered his room, Luzhin asked her if Raskolnikov was present. "It was essential for him that you should be there. That's it. That's it." Sonia was relieved but still an emotional wreck after this traumatic incident. Katerina was breathing heavily. Everyone had started to crowd around Luzhin, but the man took his chance to get out of there before things turned violent, not admitting defeat, but claiming the thief had clearly been unmasked and he would be prosecuting, because no judge is as blind as a room full of drunks and infidels. Lebeziatnikov yelled after him that he better be gone from his room by the time he gets back. One guest grabbed a bottle and threw it at Luzhin, but they missed and it took out the landlady instead. And with that, Luzhin was gone, leaving Sonia traumatized, Katerina scandalized, and the rest of the room in the early stages of a mob. Sonia dashed out of the room in tears, and Raskolnikov grabbed his hat and set off after her. "Well, Sofia Semyonovna," that's Sonia's actual first and patronymic name. I don't think I've used it yet in the book. "Well, Sofia Semyonovna, we shall see what you'll say now." When he reached her large but shabby apartment, she was crying into her hands as she sat at her table. When he appeared in the door, she rushed over to greet him, saying if it hadn't been for him, something awful might have happened. He went and sat in the very chair that she had just gotten up from and told her that it was because of her social position and habits that she was even a target for what had just happened. He asked her if she understood that. Her relief was quickly drowned in the fear of having another painful conversation with him like she had just had the day before, and she begged him not to speak to her the way he had yesterday. He told her that after she left, the landlady had told Katerina Ivanovna to get her kids out immediately, and Sonia cried out that she had to get back to them at once. "It's always the same thing with you," Raskolnikov shouted in disbelief. "You've no thought except for them. Stay a little with me." "But Katerina Ivanovna," she muttered, "she'll come find you. She has nowhere else to turn, does she? You're better off staying here where she knows where you'll be." "You realize if it hadn't been for Lebeziatnikov and me, you'd have been prosecuted and likely sent to prison, right?" Yes, she said repeatedly, disassociating from her hellish circumstances. "And what if you had gone to prison? Then what?" She didn't have an answer for him. He leaned forward on the seat. "Listen, we must talk about something." Sonia's eyes darted at him, but she was still breathing heavily. "If things come down to it and you had to make a choice to let either Luzhin or your family go on living, how would you decide which of them was to die?" She looked at him, horrified, but said that she had suspected he might ask her something like this. "Why do you ask about what cannot happen?" she stammered. "Then you're saying it would be better for Luzhin to go on living and doing wicked things." "It is not for me to know the divine providence," she exclaimed. "Oh, well, if you include divine providence, then there is no doing anything," he grumbled. "Why can't you just say what you mean to say? Are you leading up to something again? Or do you simply delight in torturing me?" She was crying bitterly. "You're right, Sonia." His tone softened. He no longer felt like playing puppet master. "I told you yesterday that I was not coming to ask forgiveness, and yet what I said about Luzhin and Province was for my own sake. I was asking forgiveness." He attempted a smile, but it came out kind of crooked, and his head dropped and hung motionless. When he looked back up, her pained and anxious eyes were fixed on him. There was a form of love in her gaze. He didn't feel ready, but he couldn't put it off any longer. He felt the same urgency he had felt when he held the axe in his hands as the old woman had stood with her back to him. Sonia could tell he was nervous, and she grabbed his hands in hers, commenting on how much he appeared to be suffering. He smiled at her kindness. "You remember what I said I would tell you if I came to you today? That I'd tell you who killed Lizaveta?" She began to tremble, but said nothing. "Well, I've come to tell you." "How do you know?" she asked, frightened. "I just know," he said. "Have they found him?" "No." "Then how do you know about it?" Her question was barely more than a whisper. He looked at her intently and said, "Guess." She trembled some more. "But why do you frighten me like this?" She was smiling a scared smile, like when you're desperately wishing someone would tell you this was all a joke. "I must be a great friend of his since I know," he said, still not able to say it outright. "He did not mean to kill Lizaveta. It was an accident. He only intended to kill the old woman. They stared at each other, her in fear, he in calm desperation. You still can't guess? No, she stammered. Take a good look, he said. The look on Sonia's face after he said this froze his heart. It was exactly the look of wordless terror that Lizaveta had on her face as he held the bloody axe. Sonia gazed at him with the same paralyzed terror that the innocent woman had that night. Have you guessed? He asked again, softly. Please, no, she wailed from the depths of her bosom. She collapsed on her bed, but almost immediately jumped back up, coming to him, and grabbed his hands as she stared into his eyes for any sign that this wasn't true. But in his gaze, she found only honesty. He begged her to say something. He had not rehearsed revealing it this way. It's just how it happened. She paced the room and then sat beside him before ultimately falling to her knees in tears. What have you done? What have you done to yourself? She cried out. She embraced him with a tear-stained hug, and he pulled back to attempt to smile weakly. You are a strange girl, Sonia. You kiss me and hug me when I tell you about that? You don't think what you're doing. She was nearly hysterical as she cried that there must be no one as miserable as he is currently. And this is what he was not prepared for. Of all the emotions he had considered would be her reaction, feeling sorry for him, feeling pity, had not crossed his mind. His own eyes filled with 2 tears that hung on his eyelashes. Then, you won't leave me? He asked, daring to hope for a second. No, no, she cried. Never, nowhere. I will follow you wherever you go. Why couldn't I have known you before? What is to be done now? Her face looked like that of someone racing to come up with a solution. I'll go with you to Siberia, she proclaimed. He pulled back at this. But I don't want to go to Siberia yet, he said. This change in tone from him seemed to wake her up to the fact that she was talking to a murderer. How could you? You, a man like you, how could you bring yourself to... What does it even mean? You were hungry? It was to help your mother? Yes? He sighed heavily, knowing he could not confess to murder and then lie about his motives. No, Sonia, I was not so hungry. I did want to help my mother, but that's not the real reason. Please, Sonia, don't torture me. How could you give your last farthing away and then rob and murder? She cried. She then got a horrible feeling, wondering if the money he'd given to her stepmother was blood money. He saw that idea forming on her mind and quickly put it to rest, saying his friend could even vouch for him receiving that money from his mother. And as for that money, meaning what he'd stolen, I don't really know how much money there was, he said. I buried what I took before I really even counted it. But you said your purpose was to rob her, and yet you took nothing? I don't know, he said, standing up and beginning to pace himself. I know you expect an explanation from me now, Sonia. I can see it on your face, but what can I tell you? You won't understand my reasoning and will only suffer for hearing me try to explain it. Why are you crying and embracing me again? Because you think I will feel better? How could you feel love for such a mean wretch as I? She hugged him tightly as she spoke into his chest. But aren't you suffering too? His heart began to soften again. There it was. Pity. He had received none from anyone up until now. Everyone else only wanted his explanations. Only she felt that explanations were less important than acknowledging that there was pain. I have a bad heart, Sonia, he said. I have come to you because I am bad, because I am a coward. Why did I come here? She looked up into his eyes and tried to tell him that he was right to come. He was lost in thought, for asserting that the real reason to him why he'd killed the old woman was because he'd wanted to become a Napoleon. Do you understand now? He asked. Sonia was terrified and confused at this, but she begged him to continue explaining, promising that she would come to understand what he was trying to say. It went like this. One day I asked myself, what if someone like Napoleon were in my place? What if, instead of great battles and historic moments, his path forward depended on killing a ridiculous old pawnbroker just to get the money to start his career? Would he hesitate because it wasn't grand enough? Because it was ugly? Because it was a sin? I tortured myself with that question until I realized suddenly that it wouldn't trouble him at all. He wouldn't see anything there to stop over. If there were no other way, he would have killed her without a second thought. So I stopped thinking too. I killed her, following his example. That's all there is to it. And maybe the most terrible thing of all is that this is exactly how it happened. Sonia did not seem comforted by this at all. You better tell me straight out without examples, she said. You're right again, Sonia. It is all nonsense, mostly talk. You know our situation. My mother had almost nothing. My sister, despite her education, was stuck in humiliating work, and all their hopes were on me. I was a student, but I could not afford to pay, even if I dragged myself along in 10 or 15 years. If I was lucky, I might end up with a minor clerk or a small salary, but by then, my mother would be worn down by worry, and I still wouldn't be able to help her. And my sister, she might have ended up worse. It's hard to live like that, to watch everything slip by, to accept insults to your family and do nothing. And what would come after? A wife, children, more mouths to fail? So I decided to take the old woman's money. I told myself it would get me through university, spare my mother, and give me a real start, a clean break, a new life. That was the plan. Of course, killing her was wrong. That's all. No, that's not it, she said, more distressed, after hearing him try to explain, but not making any sense to her mind. I know to you that doesn't seem like it could be, but I am speaking the truth, Sonia. I only killed a louse, a useless, loathsome, harmful creature. She was a human being, Sonia cried out. You're right again. I'm talking nonsense. That can't be, she yelled, desperate for something to make more sense than anything he had said. No, Sonia, that's not it, he said suddenly, lifting his head, as if a new thought had jolted him awake. That's not the truth. It would be better, yes, much better, to say that I am vain, envious, spiteful, petty, resentful, maybe even unstable. Let's say it all at once. People have already hinted at madness, I've noticed. I told you I couldn't stay at the university, but maybe I could have. My mother would have helped with the fees. I could have earned enough for food and clothes. There was work, Razumihin works, but I didn't. I sulked. That's the word. I shut myself away and refused. I sat in my room like a spider. You've been there. You've seen it. And do you know, Sonia, that low ceilings and tiny rooms cramp the soul and the mind? He tries to explain to some degree his extraordinary man theory, saying that whoever is strong in mind and spirit will have power over the masses, and anyone who is greatly daring is right in their own eyes. Quote, he who despises most things will be a lawgiver among them, and he who dares most of all will be most in the right. So it has been till now, and so it always will be. A man must be blind not to see it. I divined then, Sonia, he went on eagerly, that power is only vouchsafed to the man who dares to stoop and pick it up. There is only one thing needful. One has only to dare. I only wanted to have the daring, Sonia. That is why I killed her, not for her money, not because she was wicked, but to prove to myself that I had the daring to do it. Stop, she cried out. You have turned from God, and he has smitten you. He has given you over to the devil. I know that it was the devil leading me, Sonia. I know it all. I have thought it over many times myself. I've argued every point. I want nothing more than to forget it and start a new beginning. I now know that killing someone, even a louse, was not for me, though it might still be for a man who would go straight to his goal without asking questions. I am no Napoleon. I told myself over and over that I was committing murder to help others, but the truth is I did it for myself. I wanted to know if I was capable of stepping over boundaries or not, whether I am nothing but a trembling creature, or if I have the right. He trailed off. To kill? Sonia interjected. Have the right to kill? He shrugged. Don't interrupt me, Sonia. I only meant to say that I see that it was the devil who led me on, and now it is he that shows me how far from the path I've strayed, so that he can mock me for my foolishness. When I killed the old woman, I didn't murder her. I murdered myself. I am the one that is crushed forever. His agony was finally welling up inside of him, saying these things out loud for the first time. He clasped his hands around his head and squeezed. Sonia again sympathized with his suffering. What am I to do now? He gasped. Suddenly, Sonia's composure changed. She seemed bright, and her eyes shone. She grabbed him by his arms and pulled him to his feet. Raskolnikov was completely caught off guard by the sudden change in her. Go at once, this very minute, and stand at the crossroads. Bow down, kiss the earth, which you have defiled, and say to all men aloud, I am a murderer. Then God will send you life again. Will you go? Will you go? She was holding his hands, looking at him with hope and desperation. You mean Siberia? That I must give myself up? He had hoped there would be a different solution. That is the only way to expiate your sin, she stated. No, I'm not going to them, he said. Sonia became upset. How will you ever speak to your mother again? He expressed a distaste for the idea of leaving his judgment and redemption to the state, which he points out has killed millions, and that they look at themselves as virtuous for the act. Besides, if I tell them I murdered her and don't even have any money, they will laugh at me and call me a coward as well as a fool. They wouldn't understand. Sonia pressed him, saying it will be too much for him to bear to go on like this. Then again, he said, maybe I have been too quick to judge myself a louse. Maybe I am a man and can make another go of it. But how can you bear this burden your entire life, she begged. I shall get used to it, he replied. She moaned at this, and he expressed his confusion that she had just said she was willing to follow him to Siberia, but she was pained by his desire to live with the burden. He assures her there is no real evidence that could lead to his conviction. Sure, they will arrest me at some point, but they don't have enough evidence, enough real proof to convict me. I give you my word. Will you come visit me when I'm in prison, he asked. She nodded her head without saying anything, assuring him she would. He could see the great love she felt for him in her eyes, and suddenly it felt like a burden to be so loved. What an awful sensation, he thought. He had hoped that coming here would relieve some of his pain, but now he felt it even greater because he knew Sonia felt pain on his behalf. He was less happy leaving than he thought he would have been when he got there. She asked him if he had a cross with him, and he didn't understand the question at first. She realized due to his atheistic stance he wouldn't, so she ran and grabbed one of hers, a cross made of cypress wood. She handed it out to him as she said that she has a second cross, a copper one she got from Lizaveta. She will wear that one, and they will suffer together, bearing their crosses. He told her, not now, but it would be better later. She sniffed and nodded, saying, yes, only when you are ready to meet your suffering, and that she'll hold on to it until he's ready. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was Mr. Lebeziatnikov. Okay, this is as good a time as any for a brief bio on our author Dostoevsky. I'm keeping this one pretty straightforward. I didn't dive super deep because it just feels like his mind has been present through this entire book. Like we're understanding how he thinks without having to get a background story on him. But there are some details that are very fascinating when you hear about the coming of this author. So he was born in 1821 in Moscow. His father was a military doctor who worked at a hospital for the poor, which meant that Dostoevsky grew up around sickness, suffering, and death, even from a young age. And at the same time, his father was a very harsh, authoritarian figure. And that combination, that deep exposure to human pain paired with fear of authority, seemed to stay with him for the rest of his life. As a young man, Dostoevsky trained as a military engineer in St. Petersburg, but his real obsession was ideas. He read everything he could get his hands on. European romantic writers, German idealists, French social theorists, yada, yada, yada. Like a lot of young intellectuals of his generation, he became increasingly critical of censorship, autocratic rule, and serfdom. He wasn't necessarily a revolutionary, but he was restless and convinced that the world could be fixed if people just thought clearly enough. That mindset is what eventually pulled him into the Petrashevsky Circle in the late 1840s. This wasn't some terrorist group or armed rebellion. It was actually a room full of writers like himself. He'd already published a book at this point, if not two. But it was a room full of writers, students, civil servants that all sat around and talked about things like banned books, socialism, Western philosophy, and political reform. And for the most part, they just talked. But in Tsarist Russia, especially under Nicholas I, talk alone could be very dangerous. And Dostoevsky's biggest crime was reading aloud a banned letter by the critic Vissarion Belinsky, a blistering attack on the Orthodox Church and the autocratic state. That was all it took, because in April of 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested. After months in prison, he was sentenced to death. In December of that year, he was taken to a public square, dressed in a burial shroud, tied to a post, and prepared for execution by firing squad. The rifles were even raised, and he was standing there, fully convinced he was about to die. And at the last possible moment, a messenger arrived with a reprieve from the Tsar. His execution had been commuted, but this wasn't actually mercy. It turned out this had been the plan the entire time. It was psychological torture to let him go the full length of believing he was going to die before receiving this pardon. Dostoevsky later said that those moments before his expected execution completely destroyed his old worldview. Because when you believe you have 60 seconds left to live, abstract ideas suddenly stop mattering. Life itself becomes unbearably precious. Any philosophy that justifies killing or sacrificing people for a greater good starts to look obscene. But it wasn't like they just let him off the hook, because even though he wasn't being executed, he was sent to Siberia for 4 years of hard labor. This is after having been in jail for about a year. And while he was there not as a political prisoner, but as a common criminal, he actually was on chain gangs with thieves and murderers, and he had to endure brutal conditions, disease and isolation. He wasn't even allowed to write. The only book he was allowed to keep was the New Testament. And during this time, he lived shoulder to shoulder with men who had committed horrible crimes, and he slowly realized that intelligence didn't equal virtue, that education didn't make someone morally superior, and that ideas didn't really predict character. He saw that suffering doesn't automatically redeem anybody. It can just as easily make a person bitter, cruel, or hollow. And even after finishing his prison sentence, he still wasn't free. He was forced to serve another 6 years as a soldier in Siberia. It was humiliating. He was of a respectable family, but was reduced to the ranks, not as an officer. But that gave him the time to observe and to reflect and to slowly re-enter life. And when he finally returned to European Russia, he was not the same man who had debated theories in rooms with other intellectuals. He had stood in front of a firing squad. He had lived among murderers. He had watched these abstract ideas collapse when they pressed against real human suffering. So when he later writes this book, Crime and Punishment, about a young intellectual destroyed by incomplete ideas, he isn't speculating. He's remembering. Lebeziatnikov had come to tell Sonia that her stepmother had seemingly lost her mind, how Katerina Ivanovna had stormed off from the funeral meal where the landlady was screaming at her to leave, and she went straight to a local official's house looking for justice, how she'd interrupted his dinner party and even attempted to assault him when he didn't immediately agree to help her, and she'd returned with some bruises, grabbing the little ones and claiming they would be out on the street so all could see how well-born children, whose father was an official, were reduced to begging in the street. Sonia grabbed her cloak and ran off without another word. Raskolnikov went home. He was sitting in silence, contemplating how maybe it would be better for him to just go to Siberia when Dunya showed up. She begged him to not be angry with her, saying that Razumihin had explained everything, and she just wanted to let him know that she understands why he's acting so strangely. But it turns out she only thinks he's being suspected of murder. So that moment on the staircase where we thought Razumihin may have figured it out, turns out he still doesn't really know. To be fair, I've skimmed over some parts that imply he had suspected that's what his friend meant on the staircase, but then he had heard about Nikolai's confession and immediately threw his own suspicions out the window. And so all he told Dunya was that her brother was being suspected of murder. So she tells him that she understands why he's acting so strange, but just begs him to remember their mother and to try to not break her heart. She gets up to leave without looking for more conversation, but Raskolnikov blurted out her name to get her to stop. And when she turned back, he simply said, "That Razumihin, Dmitry Pokovich, is a very good fellow." She blushed. Her brother continued to praise his friend, saying he is hardworking and capable of real love. She asked a question that kind of called out how he seemed to be attempting to replace himself in the family, but he just shrugs it off and says goodbye. She stood in the doorway for a minute, taking in the disturbed and broken image of her brother that she loved so well, and then turned to leave. Unable to sit alone, Rodion began to wander the streets aimlessly with a million thoughts streaming through his head. He is interrupted when he is found by Lebeziatnikov, who, despite our first introduction to him about finding out he beat Katerina Ivanovna, so far he has seemed to be nothing but helpful now that we're actually seeing him. But he has been looking for Rodion to tell him that Sonia had been searching all over for him because the crazed, tuberculosis-ridden widow and her children had actually made good on her promise to take them out into the street. Now, this is the other section I said that's kind of heartbreaking about her that I'm not going to cover in great detail, but it does show in painful fidelity the crazed and diseased state of Katerina Ivanovna and how her pride and madness combined with her impossible circumstances led to her dragging her little children into the street to perform for money as she beat a pan lid for rhythm. She is hostile to passerbys, shouting about how the poor children have been reduced to this because of the cruelty of society. And then she chews out the children for crying instead of performing in the form of dance or singing French songs. It really feels like Dostoevsky was purposefully trying to make you experience the tragedy that she's going through, putting you in a position where you're unable to avert your attention because it's like 5 pages of us just taking this scene in. And I'm not focusing on it, not because I'm squeamish or think it's not valuable, but it has almost nothing to do with Raskolnikov, and she will not be a character for much longer. This is just a heart-wrenching send-off that shows how not everyone gets happy endings. When you read this for yourself, you'll see what I mean. And it ends with Katerina collapsing with a fit of consumption, and Sonia had been able to convince some officials to carry the woman to her own room, where a crowd formed, and among those present was Svidrigailov from next door. Katerina regains consciousness briefly for a farewell and her own sadness at seeing how Sonia lived. She had never been here before, and it only reminded Katerina Ivanovna how much Sonia had sacrificed for the family. But within a few more minutes, she was gone, and Raskolnikov walked up to the window and stared out into the hot summer night, where the stars seemed to be hiding in the blackness of the sky. When Svidrigailov came up to him, saying how he needed a word with the young man, he tells Rodion that he will foot the bill to put the 3 little children in a respectable orphan's home, and he will set aside 1,500 rubles each for when they come of age, so that Sonia need not worry about them. He asks Rodion to let Dunya know this is how he will spend the 10,000 rubles he had intended for her. "Why would you be so generous?" Rodion asks suspiciously. "Ah, you are a skeptical person," Svidrigailov laughed. "I've told you before I don't need the money. Can you not accept that I am just doing it for humanity? After all," he said, leaning in with a coarse whisper, "she wasn't a louse, you know," pointing to the corpse of Katerina Ivanovna. "She wasn't like some old pawnbroker, was she? I mean, you'd agree, wouldn't you? Is Luzhin to continue on living and doing wicked things, or is she to die? And we both know if I didn't help out, Polenka would go the same way as Sonia." He said these things without breaking eye contact with Raskolnikov, whose eyes had grown wide in shock. There was a sly smile on the older man's face. Rodion, who had turned white as a sheet, took a step back from the gentleman in fear. How do you know?" he stammered. "Why, you see that door over there," he pointed. "The landlord is an old friend of mine. That is my room, just through there." "You?" Raskolnikov struggled to get out. "Yes," Svidrigailov continued, now laughing at the fact that his little rat was now aware that he'd been caught in a trap. "I assure you, on my honor, Rodion Romanovitch, that you interest me enormously. I told you we should become friends. Well, here we are. And you are about to learn what an accommodating person I can be. You'll see that you can get along with me quite nicely." Okay, I have a confession at this point, because I profess to be an understander of stories, right? Someone who can piece together the mechanical workings of a plot and what makes a good one from a bad one. Well, the truth is, in spite of this, if a story is particularly well told to me, I'm sometimes susceptible to still being duped into not seeing a plot twist if it is well executed. And this is one I was duped by. I mean, it was only 3 or 4 chapters ago where we literally were told that Svidrigailov had been listening to the first conversation through the door and he'd set a chair there so he could spy more comfortably next time. I'm sure plenty of you who are more shrewd than I thought about this while Raskolnikov was confessing everything to Sonia, but my thick skull and the story-loving brain inside it totally spaced it. So this reveal threw me for a loop. I'm sure there are many of you who are in the same boat, and I think this just goes to show part of Dostoevsky's skill at packing so many plot points in between the setup and the reveal that we end up forgetting. The chapter starts saying, quote, "A strange period began for Raskolnikov. It was as though a fog had fallen upon him and wrapped him in a dreary solitude from which there was no escape." Since the author doesn't call it out this point blank, I just want you to think about the toll on Raskolnikov's well-being based on how much whiplash he goes through in a very short period of time. Every time he thinks he's gotten a handle on how he feels about the situation, something external happens that makes him certain he is going to be discovered and convicted. It has been unrelenting. The narrator even points out that when he would try to recall this period of his life later, Raskolnikov would remember the shifts between morbid uneasiness and then long stretches of complete apathy. He never felt anything good, but he went through massive mood swings based on the events around him. He was particularly worried about Svidrigailov. Of all the people he knew that could find out, Svidrigailov was the one he couldn't predict what would happen. We are told that some amount of time passes, 2 or 3 days. He'd even bumped into Svidrigailov once or twice, but they hadn't spoken of it further. The older man had confirmed that he had made arrangements for the children to be taken care of and that on their next meeting, there were more things that needed to be discussed. Sonia had not spoken to him or even looked at him the last 2 days, despite him coming to visit her room where Katerina had been laid out in a casket with candles around for visitors to mourn. Svidrigailov had even paid for a priest to come multiple times a day to offer prayer, and yet Raskolnikov and Sonia had not spoken. As Rodion watched a priest perform one of the daily prayers, Sonia did come up to him and without a word, held his hands in hers and rested her head on his chest. He felt surprised by this, that despite all that had happened, all the ugliness he had shown her that was inside of himself, she could still touch him without disgust. He left without a word and continued to wander aimlessly after spending another night sleeping in bushes like he did earlier in the book. He wandered home and sat in silence while the world turned around him. That afternoon, the door to his garret opened and Razumihin stormed in. It's another interaction that shows just how good-hearted of a man he is. At first, he shows his relief that Rodion is alive and eating. The maid Nastasia had brought him some food just before. But it quickly turns to him chewing his friend out, going as far as telling him to go to hell for how he's treated his mother and sister. He expresses his inability to comprehend why he is acting this way. He describes how his mother is feeling unwell with her worry, so he is relieved to see his friend is acting somewhat sane for a change and that he is eating, but he says there is still some secret about what's going on. And he says he doesn't intend to worry his brains over his friend's secrets. And then, one of my favorite lines in the book, quote, "So I've simply come to swear at you." In about as good-natured of a state as he's been for most of the book, Raskolnikov tells his friend how he has seen his sister recently and how they talked about him. Raz eagerly asks what details had been said, and Rodion doesn't hold back from explaining how he'd laid a number of compliments on his name. "I didn't tell her you love her because she knows that herself," he said. Raz slumped into a chair at these words. "She knows herself? It's pretty obvious." He essentially gives his blessing to his friend, and hinting that wherever he must go, he's sure his family is in good hands. "Ah," cried Razumihin, "there you go again. What do you mean, wherever you might go? Of course, though, it's all a secret, isn't it?" But his bitterness had been swallowed up in the report that Dunya seemed to like him, and he found himself in a much better mood. But he does find himself trying to figure out what his friend's secret could be. He lands on assuming that his friend must be part of some political conspiracy, and that he is about to take a very desperate step. "That's certain. That's all it can be," he thought to himself. So, like I said, even that scene on the staircase, he did not piece it together. Feeling reassured that he just misunderstood his friend, he mentions offhandedly that Dunya had gotten a letter that day that had upset her a lot. After reading the letter, Dunya had begun to cry at the mention of Rodion's name, and she'd even said something about how they may soon have to part. It was pretty disturbing. After Raz leaves, Rodion picked up his cap and went to the door to have it out with Svidrigailov. He needed to know what the man wanted. But when he opened the door, standing a few steps away from him, was Porfiry Petrovich. "Perhaps this will be the end," Rodion thought as he gestured the smiling inspector up to his door. "I'm sure you weren't expecting a visitor, Rodion Romanovitch," he said as he climbed the last steps. "I was passing by and thought, why not stop off for 5 minutes? I see you were just headed out. I promise not to keep you long. Just give me one cigarette." Rodion's insides shook as he offered Porfiry a seat, but his mind was calm. The last moment had arrived. The last drops had been drained. So a man will sometimes go through half an hour of mortal terror with a brigand, yet when the knife is at his throat, he feels no fear. Rodion sat across from Porfiry and stared at him silently, desperately waiting for him to speak. But the inspector was taking his sweet time lighting up a cigarette. Porfiry held up his lit cigarette and called it positively pernicious, but he just can't give them up, saying his doctor has told him to quit, but he's a coward. Raskolnikov immediately clocked the way the inspector was again trying to use his casual topics of conversation to put him at ease. He just looked at Porfiry gloomily. "I've come to have it out with you, Rodion Romanovitch. I owe you an explanation." He apologizes for how he treated him at their last visit, saying it was ungentlemanly behavior from him. "I've decided openness is better between us," Porfiry said. He admits to having locked up the workman in the next room, how he knows the workman had come straight here to apologize after Nikolai had confessed. He admitted he let himself get too carried away with his own games. "I wanted to tell you this first, frankly and quite sincerely, for above all, I don't want to deceive you. The first time I met you, I felt drawn to you, although I know you disliked me from the start. He said how he had suspected Rodion early on from what he knew about his writing and the fact that he had pledges with the old woman, but from 100 rabbits you can't make a horse, 100 suspicions don't make a proof, as the old English proverb says. But that's only from the rational point of view. He confesses to having led him on when he brought up the article at their first meeting and how he was impressed with how firmly and passionately Rodion had defended his thesis that day. He cites several other things, his conversations with Razumihin, how Zamyatov had come to him talking about that crazed encounter with Raskolnikov in the tavern. He even admits that he'd had Rodion's garret searched, only to find nothing. Everything he had was suspicion. There was no evidence. He turns to the topic of Nikolai, noting that he's sure Rodion had clocked immediately that Porfiry was not buying the confession from the painter for a moment. Nikolai isn't exactly a coward. He's more like a child or an artist. He's innocent, easily influenced, emotional and imaginative. He sings, dances, tells stories, makes people laugh, and drinks too much when others encourage him, not out of habit, but out of suggestibility. He even stole once without really understanding what stealing was. He is a religious dissenter, an old believer type, deeply influenced by wandering ascetics and a spiritual elder. Then this whole affair happened. Terrified of a trial, he tried to hang himself and ran away. The very idea of a court frightens people like him. In prison, he returned to religion, to the Bible, to the idea of suffering. For people like Nikolai, suffering isn't about justice or benefit. It's something you must endure, especially at the hands of authority. The worse it is, the more meaningful it feels. I suspect Nikolai wants to take his suffering, to accept guilt, whether it's his or not. He doesn't know that I know this yet, but he'll come confess eventually. He won't hold out. I've been studying him too closely. On some points, he's prepared and clever, but on others, he's completely lost and doesn't even realize how little he understands. But when you look at the known facts, the idea that Nikolai could have pulled it off just doesn't add up. There was a pause, and for the first time in minutes, Rodion spoke. Then, who then is the murderer? He held his breath, waiting for the response. Porfiry sank back in his chair with a quizzical look on his face. Who is the murderer? He asked, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Why, you, Rodion Romanovitch, you are the murderer, he said very lightheartedly. Raskolnikov jumped from the couch, caught himself, and sat back down after a few seconds, his face twitching. You've been misunderstanding me, my boy. I said I came here to deal openly with you. I didn't murder her, Rodion said, like a frightened child caught in the act. No, it was you, Rodion. There is no one else, Porfiry spoke sternly, but there was still a hint of a smile on his face. They sat in silence for several minutes, Rodion barely twitching, Porfiry just observing him with amusement. When the silence finally broke, it was Raskolnikov scowling at the inspector, saying he was just up to his old tricks. Oh, stop that, Porfiry said. What does that matter now? The fact that I came here alone proves I'm not here to chase and capture you like a hare. Whether you confess to me or not doesn't matter. I'm satisfied at this point. If you consider me guilty, why not take me to prison? Rodion asked. Oh, that's your question. I will give you an answer there. First of all, it doesn't interest me to arrest you so directly. He says that with the current evidence and the very psychology he has used to catch the young man in his trap, it's simply evidence that can, again, cut both ways, as he said in their first encounter. It would be easy enough to claim he was just drunk that night he showed up to the apartment where the workers were asking about blood. But more importantly to Porfiry, he said the real reason he had come to him like this was in his desire to deal openly, despite how it may go against protocol, because he genuinely does like the young man. But thirdly, he has a proposition. Turn yourself in, and it will go infinitely more to your advantage than if I were to drag you there. Do you not consider that open and honest? Rodion was silent for a minute. You've just told me you have nothing but psychology to go on. What if you're mistaken? Oh, no, Rodion Romanovitch, I will put you in prison one way or another. I am not mistaken. I have, by providence, come across a little fact that ensures it. What fact? Oh, I will not be sharing that with you, my boy. It makes no difference to me how you are thrown in prison. So listen, when I say I am doing you a favor, giving you the chance to turn yourself in. Raskolnikov smiled darkly. That's not simply ridiculous, it's positively shameless. Even if I were guilty, which I don't admit to, why should I believe you that it will be better for me? You must know confessing will lessen your sentence, Porfiry said. That's basic law. Plus, you can easily paint your condition at the time as circumstance and not character. This murder is an aberration, not your defining act. I am an honest man, Rodion Romanovitch. I will keep my word. After hanging his head in silence for a bit, Rodion shook it and laughed. No, it's not worth it. I don't care about lessening the sentence. I was afraid you'd say that, but do not disdain life. You have so much left in front of you, and you could retain more of it outside prison walls if you just confess. So you made up a theory and then felt shame when it broke down and turned out to be not at all original. It turned out to be something base, but thankfully you did not deceive yourself for long and you tested its extremities in one instant. You know, I regard you as one of those men who smiles as their torturer cuts their entrails out. You have long needed a change of air. Maybe suffering is what you need. Perhaps Nikolai was right. I know you must not believe in all that, but don't let your brain keep you from living your life. Fling yourself straight into life without deliberation. Don't be afraid. In some ways, it may have been the best case scenario that you killed the old woman. Maybe, if you'd had time to develop another theory, you'd have done something 1,000 times more heinous. You have taken a step across the line, and now justice needs to be met, not only by the law, but in your own mind. I know you feel that. Rodion started and snapped back. But who are you? What kind of prophet do you proclaim to be with these words of wisdom? Oh, I am nothing but a man of feeling and sympathy, perhaps with a little knowledge. But my time is already on the way out. You, however, have so much life before you, if only you allow it. You will never live again if you spend the rest of your life burying this transgression. What if I ran away? Raskolnikov poses. Oh, you won't run away. A peasant would run. A man who has nothing to believe might run. But you already have stopped believing in your theory. What would you run away with? Your life would be miserable, living not only with the shadow of the law hunting you, but with the stench of your failure reminding you that a bad idea you had led you to being punished to live in misery the rest of your days. The only way you can move forward is to own up to your choices. I am convinced that once you come of your own mind to take your suffering, you will feel lighter than air. For suffering, Rodion Romanovitch, is a great thing. Raskolnikov sat there in silence, staring at the floor. He stood up and grabbed his cap. Porfiry Petrovitch, please do not take the notion that I have confessed to you this day. You are a strange man, and I've listened to you out of curiosity. But I have admitted nothing. Remember that. Porfiry stood up as well, accepting that he would need to leave before his host, saying he wouldn't dare to presume such an act had occurred in that conversation. But he encourages him to go for a walk. I have only one request of you. It's an awkward one, but important. If you were to choose another way out, he said those words deliberately to imply their dark meaning. Do leave a brief but precise note, only a few lines, and mention where the stone is. It would be very generous of you. But till we meet, good thoughts and sound decisions to you. Porfiry left, and Raskolnikov sat at his window to make sure he saw the inspector walk away to the end of the street before he hurried out of the room himself. He practically ran towards Svidrigailov's to resolve the matter with him. That was the one unknown still, especially now that he knew out in the open that Porfiry suspected him. But would Svidrigailov turn him in? Had he already spoken to Porfiry? Was that the providential fact that the inspector had hinted at? Did he have something else in mind to leverage Raskolnikov with that knowledge of his confession? He knew the man must still have designs on Dunya, which seemed like the most probable way he planned to play his advantage. And that thought would pass him from fear to rage and back to apathy every time he considered it. But now he considered if he would have to turn himself in just to save Dunya from whatever design Svidrigailov had. Was that the troubling letter she'd received that Raz had mentioned? He had been so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice that sitting at a tea table by the open window in a cafe smoking a pipe was Svidrigailov himself, who was watching Raskolnikov with great interest. But Rodion finally looked up to see the older man looking at him inquisitively and was shocked for a moment. He had not expected meeting him out in the open like this. But after a moment, the older man waved him over and pointed to an empty chair at his table. He spoke to the staff as if he were a long-time customer despite having been in Petersburg less than a week. There's several pages of Svidrigailov making small talk about how they are alike and other things that make Rodion impatient to the point of saying he realizes that Svidrigailov has the power to injure him more than most, but he is mistaken if he thinks that Raskolnikov prizes himself or his own life very highly. I only came to tell you, if you still have designs on my sister, I will kill you before you can get me locked up, and you know I can do it. Besides that, if you truly have anything more to say to me, like he had hinted at their last meeting. Now is the time. I will not wait any longer. Why in such haste? Svidrigailov asked curiously. Everyone has his plans, Raskolnikov replied flatly. You keep thinking I have some plans for you, and I get that in your position, it's natural to think so, but I didn't have any specific topic to talk about with you. Then why did you say you wanted to talk? I just find you a fascinating topic of observation, my boy, and you are the brother of a person who greatly interests me. He opens about his own life, saying he had served in the cavalry and then knocked about Petersburg as a poor card sharp before Marfa Petrovna found him and straightened him out. He admits he came to Petersburg in pursuit of women. Right after you buried your dead wife, Raskolnikov asked. You're not wrong, but why do you act as if I've done something wrong in admitting this? Are you asking whether I find anything wrong with vice? Oh, vice, that's what you're after. Why should I give up women? I have a passion for them. You could say it's my occupation. So you hope for nothing here but vice. If you insist on calling it vice, I guess so, he said with a laugh. Rodion, with an emotionless face, said that's nothing to rejoice at. It's a disease, and a dangerous one at that. I won't argue that. It can be a disease, if not held in moderation. If it wasn't for this, however, I might have to shoot myself. You could shoot yourself, Raskolnikov pressed. Svidrigailov, caught in his meaningless statement, looked disgusted and said he didn't want to speak of such things. I admit it's an unpardonable weakness, but I am afraid of death and dislike it being talked of. Rodion was bored of this, and he stood up to leave, but the older man asked him to sit down for at least a cup of tea, saying he'd like to tell him the story of how a woman tried to save him once. That woman was your sister. Raskolnikov sat down cautiously, warning the older man to be careful what he says next. Svidrigailov scoffs, saying even in a worthless fellow like himself, Avdotia Romanovna can only excite the deepest of respects. He starts by telling the origins of his marriage to Marfa Petrovna, saying how even from the start they had a certain agreement. She was considerably older than he was, and he admits to having such a swinishness, is the word, to his demeanor, that he told her at the beginning he could not be absolutely faithful to her. He says she acted in a frenzy for a time, but it seemed that eventually she came around to being grateful for his honesty, that being the jealous woman she was, the thought of being deceived was worse than the idea of unfaithfulness. So they came to agreement. First, he would never leave her. He would be her husband to her death, and that he would never leave the estate without her consent. Third, he would never have a permanent mistress, and in return for these things, he could have a free hand with the maidservants. Next, he could never fall in love with a woman of their own class. And finally, if he did ever fall violently in love with someone, he was supposed to tell Marfa who it was. And they made this work for years. Marfa continued to be jealous and act out from time to time, but as long as he held his tongue and didn't irritate her, things moved smoothly, and she let him carry on. He kind of blames Marfa for having let such a beautiful and impressive woman as Dunya to be their governess, knowing this arrangement, but he thinks it likely that Marfa herself was taken with Dunya and could not pass by letting her be in her home. He knew the danger the first time he had seen her. So, knowing the rules, he tried to keep his distance from her at first, tried to quelch his feelings by acting coldly, and then with a laugh, he points out the irony that it was Marfa Petrovna who was angry with him for being so cold towards their governess. He comments how despite everything, he sensed that Dunya felt pity for him, and that was the final blow to his defenses. Quote, "And if once a girl's heart is moved to pity, it's more dangerous than anything. She is bound to want to save him, to bring him to his senses and lift him up and draw him to nobler aims and restore his life and usefulness." He claims that Dunya is the type of woman who craves to be a martyr. She wants to face torture from something or someone, and if it isn't forced upon her, she'll throw herself out of a window. Now that sounds like a rash thing to say, but consider how she had been determined to marry Luzhin even though he was a dud from the beginning. Svidrigailov says he's heard about this Razumihin, how he seems a sensible enough fellow. His surname suggests it, which actually is a perfect time to mention. I almost forgot to include this, but if you know anything about writing, it's not like a hard and fast rule, but it's kind of understood that you should avoid having major characters with similar names just to help the audience keep things straight. I'm not saying the names Raskolnikov and Razumihin sound identical, but they do have the first same syllable, essentially. So for an author to do this, normally there's supposed to be a dang good reason for it. And of course, with Dostoevsky, it turns out there is. The translation of these two names reveals to non-Russian readers that the author was not trying to hide anything about the nature of these two men. Raskolnikov translates to schism or rupture, meaning a split, like the split in Rodion's mind and soul, about what is the right thing for him to do. Razumihin, on the other hand, translates roughly to the reasonable one. So you see these names sound similar for a reason. And I was honestly kind of relieved to find this out because it helped me feel better about the number of times I've had to write out both of these very long names. But back to the story, Svidrigailov mentions that he's aware of Razumihin and understands how he and Dunya have started feeling things for each other. But he warns that Razumihin better be ready to look after Dunya because no matter what anyone else thinks of him, Svidrigailov is convinced that he understands the woman. He then returns to the story of his own passion for Dunya, basically claiming that in her pity-filled efforts to save him, she began to seek him out for talks, entreaties, supplications, and even tears. He acknowledges this was not in the sense of her truly feeling anything for him, but just an attempt to get closer to him so, as he'd said earlier, she could save him. But he sensed that he might have even a shot at cashing in on his passion for her, so he, in his own words, threw it all on his destiny and played the part of a man desperate for light, needing someone to guide him, and that at that point he turned to the one weapon which is most powerful to women: flattery. Nothing in the world is harder than speaking the truth, and nothing is easier than flattery. In summation of the rest of this conversation, he admits that Dunya is not the first extremely chaste woman he had attempted to use flattery to seduce. He tells of one married woman that he succeeded to win over by flattering her specifically about how chaste she was, that in a way he just desires the thrill of the hunt, if I were to say it in a few words. And he thought Dunya would be a great chase in this regard because of how chaste she was. But what really set him off in the end was when his wife, Marfa Petrovna, set up Dunya with Luzhin, who wanted to take her to Petersburg, and she accepted. Because he had made this exact same offer to her, but she had denied him. So watching her accept it from another man made him frantic. When Raskolnikov says that all of this only convinces him further that Svidrigailov has come to Petersburg with designs on his sister, the man scoffs and says it's not a concern because Dunya cannot endure the sight of him. Raskolnikov says he's aware of that, but that isn't the point. Some of the words that have been said today prove he still plans to act out some evil design on Dunya, and quickly. I have dropped words like that, he said defensively. He assures the young man that Dunya is safe from him. Do you know that I'm going to get married? Yes, you've told me before. I did? I must have forgotten. He sets up the scenario briefly. A connection of his had introduced him to a family with a daughter who is just about to turn 16. And yes, Svidrigailov is 50. This would be completely scandalous today. I get the sense that even back then, this big of a gap would have raised eyebrows, which is why I'm not going to go too much into detail of his descriptions of her because it feels kind of slimy. But the parents are poor and they welcome the idea of financial stability for not only their daughter but themselves. He recalls bringing gifts to the family and how his betrothed's face glowed at the diamonds and pearls he gave her. He says he's even headed to her after this conversation. Rodion can't help but point out that the massive age gap excites the man, and Svidrigailov doesn't try to deny it, claiming he doesn't see why Raskolnikov all of a sudden is so set on virtue, but acknowledges that he is a sinful man. Rodion couldn't reconcile how this repulsive man was the same who was willing to spend a small fortune to take care of orphans that he didn't really know. But ultimately, he tells Svidrigailov that he can tell that what the man wants more than anything is to admit his dark desires and fantasies openly to someone who is not in a position to judge him. Svidrigailov tells him he finds that quite cynical, but he must be going. They head off in different directions, Raskolnikov feeling disturbed by someone else for a change instead of himself, and Svidrigailov a little too drunk for his own good. But Svidrigailov was not headed to his teenage fiance's house like he had said. He had an appointment with Avdotia Romanovna. They met on a bridge. He had set the place and time in the letter he'd sent that morning. She looked nervous. He whisked her off the street quickly, wanting to avoid being seen by her brother. Once they had rounded a corner, they were hidden from sight, but still on the street, and Dunya stopped, saying that she would go no further than this. What did he want? He basically dangles the fact that he has a sensitive secret of her brother's that is at stake if she doesn't play along, saying She needs to come with him to meet with Sonia as well as to see some papers that he has. Dunya hesitated and after a pause said, "I know that you are not a man of honor, but I am not afraid of you. Lead the way." She looked courageous as she said this, but her face was a little pale. Sonia was not home, so he said he would show her the papers first, and if Sonia hadn't returned by the time they were done, he would send the girl to Dunya later. He points to the doorway in his second room that curiously had a lone chair seated next to it, saying that that is the adjoining room to Sonia's apartment, where he heard everything. He then invited her to sit at his table. She did so, despite feeling deeply uneasy at the look in his eyes. She pulled out the letter from this morning, tossing it on the table and asking if it can be true what he says, meaning the crime that he has hinted at her brother committing. "I've heard this story already, and it's nothing but an ugly suspicion," she said. "You have no proofs, and yet you promised to prove it, so speak." "Your brother is a murderer. He killed an old woman, a pawnbroker, where he has pawned his own goods. He killed her sister as well with an axe. He told all of this word for word to Sonia, the only person who knows his secret by his own admission. She was as horrified hearing this as you are now, but don't worry, she will not betray him." "It can't be," Dunya muttered with bloodless lips. "There is not the slightest cause or reason for him to. It's a lie, a lie." "He robbed her. That was his cause. He said so himself, but he has not made use of anything he took from her. How could he even dream of such a thing?" She was seemingly begging Svidrigailov for an explanation rather than simply denial. "There are countless reasons why people steal, I admit. I would have not believed it myself if I was hearing it secondhand as you are, but I believe my own ears." He then recounts the whole theory aspect of the crime, the Napoleon of it all, if you will. I won't retell it again like he does, but I will include one paragraph I found interesting. He tells Dunya it's galling too, of course, for a young man of gifts and overweening pride to know that if he had, for instance, a paltry 3,000, his whole career, his whole future would be differently shaped, and yet not to have that 3,000. Basically, he's saying how if a young man with all this pride and talent looked at a lifetime of a mediocre salary, but the idea of if he could have that lump sum at once in his early years, he could change his fate. After telling the whole extraordinary man theory, Dunya's first question is, "Are you saying he didn't feel any remorse?" She stood up, saying she wanted to see Sonia. "But Sonia won't be home until this evening." "So you were lying when you said she would be home? Why should I believe anything you said?" "Control yourself," Svidrigailov pleaded. She went to the door. When she grabbed the handle, it didn't budge. He had locked it behind them. "Wait a little," Svidrigailov said. "You won't be of any help to him in this emotional state. Just sit down and we can think it over." "Can he really be saved?" she asked, full of emotion. "It all depends on you. You alone," he said with eyes full of heat. Dunya pulled back from him in alarm. "One word from you and he is saved. I'll save him. I have money and friends. I'll send him away where they'll never find him. I could get a passport for you and your mother. What do you want with Razumihin? I love you too. I love you beyond everything. Anything you tell me to do, I'll do, even the impossible." He was almost raving in his passion, and Dunya ran to the door, shaking the handle, begging him to open it. He stood up, a leering smile on his face. "No one is home," he said. "The landlady is gone. You are exciting yourself uselessly." Dunya ran to the farthest corner of the room. She didn't scream, but she couldn't take her eyes off of Svidrigailov. Every move he made tormented her. He then points out that he has put her in a compromised situation regardless of what happens now. The fact that she came alone to visit a solitary man in his lodgings would cause suspicion. "You can't prove anything, scoundrel!" Dunya shouted. Svidrigailov did not advance on her, seemingly convinced that his prey was caught. He sat on a sofa across the room. Dunya, however, knew this man well enough that she wasn't going to risk anything. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small revolver. Svidrigailov jumped from his seat. "Ha, well now, that changes things, doesn't it? Where did you get that? Wait, is that my old revolver?" "It wasn't yours. It belonged to Marfa Petrovna," Dunya said with righteous fury. "The woman that you killed, wretch. Nothing in that house was yours. I swear, if you advance one step, I'll kill you." "But what about your brother?" he asked. "Turn him in if you want, but don't you move. I'll shoot. You poisoned your wife. I know it in my heart, so you are a murderer yourself." "Are you so sure I poisoned her?" "You had hinted at that being your way out back when you were trying to get me to run away with you. I always hated you," she said, with a grim look on her face. "I don't doubt you will shoot, you wild creature. Well, Shoot away! He raised his arms as if making himself a target. Even in this murderous rage, he found her even more attractive. The fire in her eyes was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He could not contain himself. He took one step towards her. Bang! The gun fired, but her aim was poor from her shaky hands. The bullet grazed the skull with just the tiniest nick, barely enough to break the skin. He laughed softly. The wasp has stung me. A single trickle of blood ran down his temple. You missed, he said. Fire again, I'll wait. But seeing that she was actually considerate, he gloomily pointed out that if he sees her cock the gun again, he will have to take it away. But before he could move, she had cocked it and pointed at him once more, screaming at him to let her be, promising to kill him. Well, at this range you can hardly miss, he said smugly, and he took 2 more steps. She pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. You didn't load it properly, he said, tempting fate, but you have another charge ready. Go ahead and load it. I'll wait. He stood there with a confidence that he would still win over this coquettish maiden, his greatest hunt of all time. She looked at him with a wild determination, but her panic kept her from having the ability to reload the gun, and she dropped it on the floor. Svidrigailov breathed deeply as he walked up to her and put his arm around her. She did not resist at first, but she made a simple plea through her tears. Let me go, she begged. For the first time, he frowned. Then you do not love me? He asked. She shook her head wildly. And you never could? He asked, now feeling stung. Never, she cried out. The inner workings of Svidrigailov's mind were unknown to Dunya, but he had never considered this possibility. He let her go and after a moment handed her the key to the room. He told her to hurry and leave. She was more than willing to oblige. And after Dunya was gone, Svidrigailov was standing at the window, looking out on the street. Eventually, his hand raised to the graze on his head, and he smiled in a strange, sad way. He cleaned up the blood before his eyes spotted the revolver laying on the floor where Dunya had left it. He picked it up and examined the 3 barrels. There was still 1 shot left. He thought for a moment, put the revolver in his pocket, put on his hat, and left the room. Now, you're probably debating in your head right now, is that bullet for himself or Raskolnikov? Well, I'm going to spoil it for you. It's for himself. At the end of this next chapter, he kills himself in front of a city official. But Jameson, why did you just spoil the chapter like that? Here's why. Because I want to spend the time I would have spent going over the events of this chapter, talking about why at nearly the end of this book, that has been all about Raskolnikov, we get essentially 4 chapters dedicated to a character who has been nothing but a minor role up until now. Why the sudden shift? Why should we care about this Svidrigailov dump that we have just been subjected to? Think about it for a second. I bet you can guess. It's because he is Dostoevsky's way of showing what comes of a man who lives thinking he is above moral law. He is the end result of someone who acts like Raskolnikov, the Potemkin man, not really capable of changing the world in any way, but feeling that as a key part of his identity, he is supposed to break rules and do as he pleases, thinking he can live above consequences. And what's so interesting to me is that in his final day, in this chapter I'm skipping over, he does generous things. He gives money to street musicians. He checks in on Sonia. He even visits the child fiancé and makes sure her family is taken care of. On top of the fact that he's already spent a ton of money providing for the orphans. But does this erase the other choices he made that made him a scoundrel? No. Does it make him an extremely complex character? Kinda. I don't think Dostoevsky is trying to show that people who put their own moral opinions above anything are by virtue evil. I think he just wants us to see that putting more stock in our own beliefs exclusively can easily result in negative side effects. Even though he never point blank says, I did this to show what would have happened to Raskolnikov, the first time they met, Svidrigailov said how he thinks they will be good friends because they have a lot in common. And then his ability to acknowledge his sins without feeling shame for them, mixed with many other little hints, paint this picture of the fact that this is where a life of your own judgment being your highest standard can lead you. If you don't have some ideal or code that you aspire to, but rather just trust yourself to do what's best for you, it often won't end in a good place. Referring to my character matrix that I developed last year, it's the most extreme version of a maverick. He wants to make good things happen for himself like a hero, but at the extreme disregard of how it affects other people. If he hadn't been swooped up by Marfa Petrovna, where he had all his needs taken care of, he would have spent all of his days in a debtor's prison. And even when he was saved, he only accepted it on conditions that were very favorable to himself. That is not a villain's life necessarily, because he's not trying to harm other people, but it's definitely not the life of a heroic figure either. And he goes out like a victim, choosing to escape reality rather than to face it. And that is the end of Arkady Svidrigailov in this book. In the events I skipped over, it talked about how rainy it had been that night before he killed himself. And so now cutting back to Raskolnikov, he was approaching the place his mother was staying at. His clothes were torn, dirty, and soaked through because once again, he had spent the night wandering rather than in his own garret. They've already come to expect my eccentricities, he thought, excusing his own appearance. His mother cried with joy to see him, but knowing he was so touchy of late, excused her emotion so as not to rile him up. I was in the rain yesterday, Mother. Pulcheria Raskolnikov bites her lips so she doesn't say anything that could be interpreted as naggy. She had learned quickly that if she wanted her son to spend time with her, she needed to not expect anything from him or criticize his choices. But she is very anxious in her attempt at executing this plan. She comments that she is reading his article for the third time, how Raz had brought a copy of the magazine. Dunya had read it also, and she begins to prop her son up, saying how she understands now why he is so busy all the time, that learned people need time to think over their ideas. She admits she doesn't really understand the article, but she is sure it is important. Rodion had actually not seen his own words in print yet and asked to see it. It was strange seeing the thoughts from his head printed in a publicly sold magazine. He didn't read much before his emotions welled, and he flung the magazine on the table. His mother says she can tell that one day he will be an important man, and she is proud of his genius. She tells him she will make coffee, but he stops her, saying that he needs to be on his way. He had learned that Dunya wasn't there, which had been his initial goal of the visit. He grabs his mother by the shoulders and says, "Mother, whatever happens, whatever you hear about me, whatever you are told about me, will you always love me as you do now?" As you'd expect, this sent her into a flurry of emotion, asking him what he means by this, but promising she won't believe anything bad anyone might say about him. He tells her that he will always love her, that he will never stop loving her, and that despite anything she hears about him, he has always loved her and tried to do right by her. She hugged him silently and then said that she now sees there is a great sorrow in him, and she wishes that she could be of help. "Where are you going, Rodia? Are you going away somewhere?" "Yes," he said quietly. "I can come too if you need me. Dunya too. Even Sofia Semyonovna if you like." That is the biggest change right there, is the fact that his mom is willing to let the prostitute hang out with her. But Raskolnikov just looked at her one more time and said goodbye. She began crying harder, asking if he was leaving today. "I can't stay. I must go," he said. "Can I come with you?" "No, but kneel and pray to God for me. Maybe your prayers will reach him." Before he could bring himself to leave, his own tears began to fall, and he dropped to his knees, kissing her feet. "What is waiting for you where you are going?" she asked. "Whatever God sends," he whispered. "Just pray for me, please." And with that, he left, grateful, after all, that only his mother had been there. It was better this way. He returned to his home to find Dunya sitting in his room. She looked horrified. She told him that herself and Sonia had been waiting for him all night. "Where were you?" "I don't really remember, sister," he said as he laid out on the sofa bed. "I wanted to make up my mind once and for all. I walked by the bridge several times. I wanted to end it right there, but I couldn't make up my mind." Dunya says that that was what she and Sonia had been most afraid of. "Then you still have faith in life?" she asked. "I don't have faith, but I have just been crying in my mother's arms. I don't have faith, and yet I asked her to pray for me. I don't understand it." "Did you tell Mother?" "Surely not." "No, I didn't tell her, but I think she understood more than I told her. I'm going right now. I thought about drowning myself to escape the shame, but then I realized that if I've believed I was strong, I shouldn't be afraid of disgrace. It's pride, Dunya." "Pride, Rodia?" A flicker of life crossed his eyes. "You don't think I was just afraid of the water, do you?" "Please, Rodia." She stood in silence. Then he rose, saying, "It's time. I'm going to turn myself in. I don't even know why." She was crying. "Will you give me your hand, sister?" She hugged him instead. "Haven't you half atoned for your crime by facing the suffering?" she asked through tears. "Crime? What crime?" he said, suddenly angered. "I killed a vile, noxious insect. Killing her was an atonement for 40 sins. She was sucking the life out of people. A crime? Ha! A crime! I now see that the real crime is my cowardice. Not to face justice, but to not be able to see this through without emotionally breaking down. Dunya became desperate. Brother, what are you saying? You have shed blood. Blood is spilled everywhere, always has been, poured out like champagne. Men are crowned and praised for it, called benefactors of mankind. Look closely and you'll see. I wanted to do good too. I would have made up for that one mistake with hundreds of good deeds. It wasn't even stupidity, just clumsiness. The idea itself wasn't wrong. It only looked foolish because it failed. Everything looks stupid once it fails. I only wanted independence, to make the first step, to gain the means, and then everything would have been justified by the good that followed. But I couldn't even manage that first step. Because I'm contemptible. Still, I won't judge in the way you do. If I'd succeeded, I'd be celebrated. Instead, I am caught. Dunya begged him to stop saying things like this, but his reply was that he has never been more convinced that what he did was not a crime. I just wasn't good enough to do what I needed to do, he said. He glanced down to see the pain in his sister's eyes. Dunya, darling, I am guilty. Forgive me. Goodbye. Don't follow me, I beseech you. Go to mother. Razumin will be with her. Do not cry about me. I'll try to be honest and manly all my life despite being a murderer. I will find a way to undo the disgrace you feel for me now. Goodbye. They left the house together. Dunya walked 50 paces before turning to watch her brother. They locked eyes one more time before he motioned angrily for her to keep going, and then he quickly rounded the corner. I am wicked. I see that, he thought to himself. The women in his life did not deserve this pain that he was causing them. But why are they so fond of me, he thought. I don't deserve it. If I were alone and no one loved me and I had never loved, none of this would have ever happened. He kept musing on the many what-ifs in his life as he walked, but he had one more stop to make. It was already dark by the time he got to Sonia's room. She was waiting there, hoping he would show up. Dunya had been to see her that morning, but eventually had gone back to Rodion's to wait. The narrator notes the two became very close in that time together. Sonia had been worried sick that his absence meant he had taken his own life. I guess one detail from the Svidrigailov chapter that I jumped over was that in his visit to Sonia, he provided her with some financial security, but also expressed his sympathy about Raskolnikov, saying that his two options were Siberia or a bullet. So that fed her fears when Rodion had disappeared overnight. When she saw him, she cried out with joy very briefly before one look at his face made her feel tragedy. Yes, Sonia, he said grimly, I've come for your cross. His tone sent a shiver down her back. He took her silence as reason to keep talking, and he says that one thing that annoys him is knowing all the questions he will have to answer to the stupid, brutish people who will pester him. They'll point fingers and jeer, and he notes that he will not go to Porfiry. He's sick of that man. He says he'd rather go to that man known as the explosive lieutenant who had been so mean to him his first visit at the station. Sonia went to her chest of drawers and took out the cross of cypress and the one of copper. She draped the wooden one around his neck. He talks some gibberish. He is a man going to his fate after all, so it's easy to understand why his mind isn't exactly focused. He tells Sonia he only came to warn her it's happening. You wanted me to do this, and now I'm going. She began to cry. He was uneasy with the emotion, but not because he was cold. His heart ached as well, and it didn't make sense to him why others would feel so much empathy for him. Why do these women weep so much for me? Sonia begged him to cross himself and say at least one prayer. He did so, even though his heart wasn't in it, and Sonia grabbed her shawl to go out with him. He told her to stay, saying he wanted to go alone. He turned and headed for the door without even saying goodbye, but Sonia was not in the mood to be told what to do. He felt like a man walking to the gallows as he hit the street. Every second he seemed to question if he could still find a way out of this, as if he could somehow live suffering-free despite all previous evidence to that. He questioned why he'd even gone to Sonia's. He didn't really want the cross. He hadn't wanted her to come with him, and he didn't feel a need to actually say goodbye. He decides that as contemptible of a person as he is, what he really wanted was only for her to feel pity for him one last time, to see the terror on her face in his behalf, to feel better knowing someone felt pain for him. What a wretch I am, he thought to himself. He arrived at the Haymarket, the place he has been to almost every day. It's where he'd heard Lizaveta make the fateful appointment. He saw a beggar holding a baby. He reached into his pocket, only finding a 5-kopeck piece, but he gave it to her anyway. The beggar invoked God's blessings on Rodion as he walked away. When he got to the middle of the square, he remembered something else about this place. It was where Sonia had told him to go and bow down, kissing the earth and confessing to being a murderer. He trembled to remember that. He felt more anxiety about the idea of doing this than turning himself into the station. But it felt like a spark kindled his soul and a fire began to spread through him. The mixture of anxiety along with hopelessness made him soften, and he began to cry openly. He fell to his knees. He felt compelled to bow down and kiss the dirty street. He stood up only to bow down a second time. He heard the peasants and the workers around him laughing, calling him a drunk, calling him a pilgrim on his way to Jerusalem. Many in the square commented on his bizarre behavior. Even though he'd bowed and kissed the ground, he still couldn't bring himself to openly declare, "I am a murderer," in public like Sonia had directed him. So he picked himself back up and started walking to the station once more. He looked to the side and was surprised to see Sonia there, standing maybe 50 steps from him, hiding behind a wooden shanty. She was following him on his path of suffering. He knew in that moment that she really was with him and would follow him wherever fate might take him. His heart twisted in gratitude and pain. He had reached the yard to the station at this point, and he paused before he began to climb the steps up to the 3rd floor. He wanted to enter like a man, so he stopped to collect himself, but he then found himself even questioning what was the point of caring about something like that if he was going to have to drink from the bitter cup anyway. He reached the 3rd floor and opened the door to the office. It was nearly empty at this time of day. Even now, doubts filled his head, considering if he should just give this all up. He looked around but saw nobody except a night clerk and almost took this as a sign to go home. But just as he turned to the door, he heard a voice say, "At your service." He turned to find the explosive Lieutenant Ilya Petrovich, who had just come out of another room. It is the hand of fate, Raskolnikov thought to himself. The explosive lieutenant was in a very good mood and seemed surprised to see a familiar face. The officer struggled to remember Rodion's name, but is very cheerful and apologetic about their first encounter. He then asked what he could help with. Rodion was getting cold feet. He said he had come thinking he'd find the clerk Zametov here. Ilya tells him that Zametov quit just the day before. But before Rodion could respond, Petrovich kept yammering about the life of intellectuals such as Raskolnikov and Razumihin. Raskolnikov raised his eyebrows inquiringly. The words of Ilya Petrovich, who had obviously been dining, were for the most part a stream of empty sounds to him. But some of them he understood. He looked at him inquiringly, not knowing how it would end. As Petrovich kept on, he started talking about how just because you're smart and a gentleman doesn't necessarily make you a good citizen, and he asks the clerk what the name of that man who had just committed suicide that morning was. Svidrigailov, came the answer. Rodion's face snapped too at this. Svidrigailov, he muttered. Yes, did you know him? The officer said with a smile. Yes, I knew him. He hadn't been here long. Yes, he had just lost his wife. He was a man of reckless habits and he suddenly shot himself. He left a note saying he dies in full possession of his faculties and that no one is to blame for his death. Raskolnikov couldn't breathe. Ilya Petrovich commented on how he looked very pale. Yes, I must go. Sorry, excuse me for troubling you. He barely made it to the stairs before he began reeling with joy. He had to support himself with a hand on the wall because his knees were weak. He felt free. This was a godsend. He pushed past people on the stairs and to the lower floor until he got to the yard. He had a large grin on his face, but it evaporated as his eyes landed on Sonia. She looked horror-stricken. She stared at him wildly, a look of agony on her face. He tried smiling at her, but her pain was too immense. He could not face what him walking free would do to her. So he gave her one more little grin and headed back into the station and up the stairs. Ilya Petrovich was surprised to see him again. Going back up the stairs had taken all the energy from Rodion's soul, and he had to lean on the table for support. You are ill. I'll get you a chair, the officer said. Here, take some water. Raskolnikov dropped onto a chair, but he kept his eyes fixed on the face of Ilya Petrovich with expressed unpleasant surprise. Both looked at one another for a minute and waited. Water was brought. It was I, began Raskolnikov. Drink some water, Petrovich said. Raskolnikov refused the water with his hand and softly and brokenly but distinctly said, It was I. killed the old pawnbroker woman and her sister Lizaveta with an axe and robbed them. Ilya Petrovich opened his mouth. People ran up on all sides. Raskolnikov repeated the statement. And okay, that is the end of the story, but not the end of the book, because we get not one, but two epilogues. So take a deep breath, and then we'll move on to these epilogues and the takeaway from the story. Now, if you're wondering why there are two epilogues, that's pretty easy to explain. The first one is mostly logistical, kind of a where are they now? The second one is more thematic. So after Rodion turns himself in, he was, of course, sent to Siberia eventually. He had not tried to play up an insanity plea. He told the facts as clearly and as brutally honest as he could. But the circumstances were so bizarre to the judges. The fact that he'd murdered a pawnbroker and stolen so little, things like this led to them assuming that he could only be convicted of homicidal mania, a temporary mental derangement without object to pursue again. On top of that, there were many witnesses who testified to how sick Rodion had been mentally. Razumihin even drummed up several examples of his friend's charity, not only towards the family of Marmelada, but even back to their university days. All in all, his sentence was set at only 8 years, partially due to Porfiry Petrovich keeping his word, that he would not register his suspicions against Raskolnikov, so when he confessed, it was received as a fully voluntary act. But it was still 8 years of penal servitude, so Siberia. But murder charges often were at least double that in the amount of years. So during the trial, his mother fell very ill. Dunya and Razumihin had to get her out of Petersburg so she could recover. She unfortunately started losing her own mind from the stress. She was often found telling people how her son would one day be a great statesman. And remember how we talked about her letter in the beginning as evidence that her happiness and feeling of success was tied to Rodion making something of himself? So the idea of him going to prison would have absolutely shaken her at the foundation. It took 5 months after his confession for him to be sentenced. But after that happened, he was sent to Siberia. Sonia followed him faithfully. And within a few months of that, Dunya and Razumihin were married. It wasn't long after that before his mother's illness became too much and she passed on. There was a regular correspondence between the married couple and their jailbird thanks to Sonia, which, as you'll see in the second epilogue, apparently in Siberian prisons there was a lot more chance for interaction between prisoners and visitors. But Sonia would write at least every month. Her letters were factual and objective, describing the circumstances of Raskolnikov's life without daring to put her own observations or feelings about anything. And among the things she wrote was that he did not like to talk much. He didn't seem very interested in the news that she gave him when she read the letters from Dunya. He didn't even seem very affected by news of his mother's death. He took a very direct and simple view of his new life, and he understood his position, expecting nothing better for the time, and he had no ill-founded hopes. Sonia was able to supply him with enough money so he could at least have tea every day, because he didn't seem to care that the food was really bad except for Sundays and holidays. But we remember that he was basically a starving student, so not having great food wasn't a big problem to him. He slept on a plank with a rug as a mattress, and Sonia even had communicated that when she first showed up, he even seemed upset with her. He spoke rudely to her, but when she kept coming, he just seemed to accept it. On holidays, she was allowed to visit him in the guardroom, but on working days, she was allowed to go to him in the workshops or kilns or fields where he was working. She had found a job as a dressmaker in a small town near the prison that was in desperate need and had made some acquaintances. The last piece of information from this epilogue is that Dunya finally learns that due to his aloofness, Rodion's fellow prisoners didn't like him, that he could go days without speaking to any of them, and as of the last letter, he had fallen ill to the point of being taken to the convict ward of the hospital. Part 2 is what goes on in prison from Rodion's point of view. In short, he didn't mind the manual labor, the poor food was still more consistent than he'd had as a student oftentimes, and he didn't care about the shaved head or the prison uniform or the chains he had to wear. His injured pride was the reason for his sour mood at almost all times. Not pride about being a prisoner, but his pride being hurt that he still couldn't believe that what he had done was actually wrong, despite his lapses in judgment where he'd carried so much guilt for it, is how he saw it. It didn't matter that his sentence was only 8 years and he would be a free man at 32. What did he have to live for? Quote, mere existence had always been too little for him. He had always wanted more, which the narrator points out is what drove him to pursue the path of the extraordinary man in the first place, and that he would have been better off if fate had only sent him repentance, a burning repentance that would rob him of sleep, then he would have been glad for it. Because then at least tears and agonies would be a form of life. But he did not repent of his crime. It's as if prison allowed his body and conscience to relax for the first time, but that only allowed him a clearer mind to evaluate how he doesn't believe what he did was wrong. Why does my action strike them as so horrible, he said to himself. Is it because it was a crime? Was it meant by crime? My conscience is at rest. Of course, it was a legal crime. Of course, the letter of the law was broken and blood was shed. Well, punish me for the letter of the law, and that's enough. Of course, in that case, many of the benefactors of mankind who snatched power for themselves instead of inheriting it ought to be punished at their first steps. But those men succeeded, and so they were right, and I didn't, and so I had no right to have taken that step. So after all of this, in his mind, his greatest sin is still simply that he didn't succeed at his mission, and worse, he confessed. He also found himself asking the question of why he had not killed himself. Was his desire to live that strong? And if so, how had Svidrigailov, who claimed to be afraid of death, overcome it? He found himself unable to relate to his fellow prisoners, most of whom came from more desperate circumstances than his own. They resented him for his education and his atheism. Once, after taking the sacrament, which he was in a chain gang, so he kind of had to go to church with the rest of them, he got beat up by a group claiming that he was an infidel and that he ought to be killed. The only thing that saved him from more aggressive actions by his fellow inmates was they all loved Sonia. And if he died, Sonia would stop coming. She posted letters on their behalves. Their families would send presents to their prisoners through her. She'd even delivered pies and rolls that she had made herself at Christmas. They called her Little Mother Sonia and would all smile whenever she came around. While in the prison hospital, Raskolnikov sank into feverish dreams once more. He had one dream of a virus, a disease that spread at the microbial level. But the thing about this disease is that it made the infected believe they had been endowed with intelligence. In fact, it made each of them believe they had been gifted with a truth that no one else had, and how that belief in self led to great violence and death. Only a few, a chosen few, survived this great plague and massacre. Sonia visited him in the hospital whenever she could, but there were strict regulations that prevented that from being very frequent. Sometimes she would just come and stand at the gate where he could see her through a window. One day he looked out to see her standing at the gate, patiently as if waiting for someone, and he felt a shudder in him, and he tried to hide from her. Then for several days he didn't see her at all, and he resented the fact that he had realized he had been expecting her to come. Once he was discharged from the hospital, he learned that she had been ill herself and hadn't been able to leave her house. One day soon after, he had been assigned to a work detail on a riverbank, pounding and baking alabaster. He found himself in the rhythm of his work, his mind wandering, until he realized Sonia was beside him. She had sat by him silently as he worked. She still looked ill. She was thinner, if that was even possible, but she smiled at him warmly, and she held out her hand to him timidly. She had often held out her hand to him, and he always took it, even if at times he did so annoyedly. He often had treated her poorly in spite of everything she had done for him. The other prisoners on his detail and the guard were elsewhere, so it was the two of them alone. Quote, how it happened he did not know, but all at once something seemed to seize him and fling him at her feet. He wept and threw his arms around her knees. For the first instant, she was terribly frightened and she turned pale. She jumped up and looked at him trembling, but at the same moment she understood, and a light of infinite happiness came into her eyes. She knew and had no doubt that he loved her beyond everything, and that at last the moment had come. They wanted to speak, but could not. Tears stood in their eyes. They were both pale and thin, but those sick, pale faces were bright with the dawn of a new future, of a full resurrection into a new life. They were renewed by love. The heart of each held infinite sources of life for the heart of the other. They resolved to be patient and endure these next 7 years together. Quote, what terrible suffering and what infinite happiness before them. He had risen again, and he knew it and felt it in his being. Starting that night even, he began smiling more and entering into conversations with his fellow inmates. They began to like him better. He found himself thinking of her constantly, feeling pain at the memories of how he had constantly tortured her, but mostly he focused on how he would repay those moments with infinite love. But that night, he could not think of anything for very long or analyze at all. He was simply feeling. Quote, life had stepped into the place of theory, and something quite different would work itself out in his mind. He had received Sonia's Bible as a gift from her when he first entered prison. It had sat unopened so far. He still didn't open it, but he looked at it, asking himself if her convictions can now be his own, her feelings, her aspirations. And Sonia also went home blissfully happy, to the point that her illness kind of came back from overexertion. It would only be 7 years, she thought. And in tradition, I'll read the last couple paragraphs as they are in the book. He did not know that the new life would not be given to him for nothing, that he would have to pay dearly for it, that it would cost him great striving, great suffering, but that is the beginning of a new story. The story of the gradual renewal of a man, the story of his gradual regeneration, of his passing from one world into another, of his initiation into a new unknown life. That might be the subject of a new story, but our present story is ended. Okay, before we get to the lesson, if you've enjoyed learning the story of Crime and Punishment and all of the nuggets we've learned so far, go ahead and drop the show 5 stars if you haven't. Give it a like. Subscribe to the show on whatever platform you're on. Helps to keep me going through massive books like this. Now, I want to walk you through how I ended up at this lesson before telling you what it is. Here's a few details from when we first met Rodion that you may have forgotten since it was 6 hours of content ago. When we first meet him, when it's leading up to the murder, he has been cooped up in this terrible little garret for the better part of a month, leaving rarely, and when he did, he hated interacting with anybody. He barely saw the sun, and when he did get outside, he looked at his fellow human beings as detestable things to be avoided. When he confessed to Sonia, he even said, quote, and do you know that low ceilings and tiny rooms cramp the soul and the mind? So he even acknowledges that the way he lived had been bad for him, even if only after the fact. But what I was hung up on by the end of the book, including one of the final paragraphs in the second epilogue, was how tactically Dostoevsky used the term life as if it were a noun. It's not something we just inherently get. It's something we have to go chase down if we want it. I've never seen another author use it this way this many times in the story. And the first time it stood out to me was after he was leaving Marmeladov's house at the night he died, when he had taken action to try and save his acquaintance, and he orchestrated the doctor getting there. He comforted the widow, gave her all of his money that he had to help. As he left that building and looked at the starry night, it says this, quote, he walked down slowly and deliberately, feverish, but not conscious of it, entirely absorbed in a new, overwhelming sensation of life and strength that surged up suddenly within him. This sensation might be compared to that of a man condemned to death who has suddenly been pardoned. So he felt a new, overwhelming sensation of life and strength that surged up suddenly within him. And if you can recall, that was the only time in the book where he had decided to not turn himself in, not because he was afraid or didn't feel guilty, but because he felt he could actually do more with his life outside of prison walls. He was invigorated. Now, I won't recall every time that life was used as a noun, but I will share the paragraph from the end that really set me on this path for the lesson, which is not what I would have expected at all coming into this book. So this is right after he has accepted Sonia and found a new desire to love and be loved. The narrator says, quote, life had stepped into the place of theory and something quite different would work itself out in his mind. Life had stepped into the place of theory, as if the two are to some extent incompatible. You can't have one entirely without damaging the existence of the other. And I wouldn't get too hung up on that aspect of it, but the idea that Raskolnikov, in all of his theorizing, his violent acts, his abusive behavior, he had been holding to this theory, making all of his choices in service to his theory, and judging everything that happened to him based on his theory. A theory which he started while in college, enough at least to write that article, but he had spent an entire month ruminating alone in his nasty little hovel about the application of that theory without sharing it with anybody. A theory that tainted him against all mankind. Now, I do find his theory a fascinating piece of conversation for debate, but I don't really care about the specifics of the theory for this purpose. His theory could have been any number of things. The point is, it's a theory that sprung from isolated intellectualism. Because remember, even at school, he had had almost no friends. His one friend was Razumihin, And the fact that Razumin was shocked to learn about the article suggests that he had no idea what Raskolnikov had been working on. And oh, the age of the internet has created millions and millions of isolated intellectuals, hasn't it? We can connect with more people than we ever could have before in history, and yet we seem to be more divided in our ideas. Remember that weird dream he had at the very end? The one about the disease that made every person feel like they held a truth no one else had, and they would go to war over their beliefs? Feels kind of prophetic, doesn't it? And that's not the only time he did this in the book. There was another time he basically predicted OnlyFans, but I can't find that note right now, so I'll have to dig it up later. But isolation makes us more and more convinced we are right. And the more convinced that we are right, the more likely we are to develop hatred for others. Now, there were points of the story where I was reminded of many of the other stories we've covered so far. I thought of Macbeth in regards to how the act was not wrong if you were up for it. Macbeth's wife seemed to think that he just needed to man up and grab the crown to justify it. Imagine if Raskolnikov had been married to Lady Macbeth. Then they would have risen to power together for sure. Think about how terrible they would have been together. But the most direct comparison I thought of was Boromir, actually. And for protagonist listeners, in our Boromir analysis episode, I covered how he tried to convince everyone to take the ring to Minas Tirith. And when Aragorn kind of shuts him down for the last time and says that that's not going to happen, he didn't change his mind. He just went quiet about it. He stopped voicing his opinion for fear of being criticized and being told no. But that was when the other members of the Fellowship started noticing his long looks at Frodo that made them uneasy. The lesson there was that harmful ideas are much more likely to be hatched in isolation because you don't have anyone to help make sure you don't go off the deep end. And that's exactly what happened with Rodion. He never once voiced the idea to anyone because they would have been appalled at him from the start. But I don't want to just rehash the idea that ideas in isolation can end up going bad. I actually want to focus on the other half of this equation, the life aspect. I want to focus on how the only times he felt life in the book were when he was with other people, experiencing things, and what that means for us. Because Raskolnikov actually had several theories that fed into his mania. The big one was about the extraordinary men, but he also had theories about himself, how he had been abandoned and deserved to feel bitter towards the world. But those moments he interacted with people he cared about or helped someone in need were when he felt better. Did you notice how he was always giving money away despite being destitute himself? Even in the final chapter, when he went to the Haymarket to confess his sin, he gave a 5-cent piece to a beggar, almost out of instinct, because that's who he was. But I'm going to give you one line to remember that will sum up what I'm trying to say here. Don't mistake thinking for living. Here's a visual aid. Think of yourself experiencing 2 different days. One day, you're going out with friends, you're going on a hike or to the beach, you drop off flowers to your mother, you go dancing, or you help build a house for Habitat for Humanity, or you meet up with a friend about a business idea that you're brainstorming together. Any combination of those things. Then the other day, you're building something special. You're writing a book, making a business plan, studying for the MCAT, whatever it is, but you put in a 14-hour day on it, only taking breaks to stretch and eat, maybe. You're crushing it. By the end of the day, you've made so much progress that you go to bed exhausted and happy at what you've done today. Both sound like good days in their own regard, right? But now, imagine experiencing these days through the eyes of a fly on the wall. In one, you're moving, you're connecting with different people, you're laughing, you're getting excited, you're serving, you're experiencing nature, yada, yada, yada. And in the other, you're sitting at a computer, nearly motionless for the entire day. Literally, envision what it would look like to be someone else watching you sit at a screen for 12 hours. It doesn't matter how productive you're being. That does not feel like life being lived, does it? Now, I love days like that second day. Don't get me wrong. There is a need for them if you want to create something special. But the problem is when that becomes all you do in your life. If you don't see friends because you're hacking away at bugs on your code. If you have grown pale because you never leave the house when the sun is up. If you can't remember the last time you did something nice for someone other than yourself, this is where it becomes worrisome. Because I don't care how productive you are being. You are living in isolation. And isolation is linked to so many problems, mental and physical. I found several studies in one single search that all back up the idea that isolation is not good for you in extended periods. Man is a social creature. In Genesis in the Bible, God himself says it is not good for man to be alone. And I'm sure we could find similar quotes from other religious and philosophical texts. Raskolnikov was not truly alone. He had a mother and a sister and at least one good friend, but he isolated himself. And if I'm being real, this is one of the most personal lessons I've ever done on the show. I hear this and I think, yikes, I need to work on this. Because do you know how many nights I spend working at my computer alone? Maybe I'll call a friend for 20 minutes to chat, but otherwise it's me sitting at my computer, plugging away at a keyboard. How many times have I skipped a social outing because I was trying to get an episode finished? I did it last weekend, in fact. Obviously, none of us are choosing isolation consciously, and we may not realize how isolated we are until we're feeling the adverse effects of it. And no, introverts, I'm not saying you have to change the core of who you are, but getting outside and experiencing the world, even by yourself or with one or two close friends, is all you need. Life is not the act of breathing while your body pumps blood through your veins. I'd call that existing. Life is when you are doing cool things with people that you like, people you care about, people who make you smile, people who you want to make smile. I'm going to rip that line from the Hobbit movie that's not in the book and adapt it a little bit and say, the world, aka life, is not in your head or thoughts. It's out there. This feels like a nuanced take on touch grass, if you get what I mean. And okay, I've got to wrap this up. But I'll close with an interesting note about what finally broke Raskolnikov from his isolated state. Because even when his friends and family and his newfound friend Sonia were physically in his presence, he pushed them away. He separated himself from them. And it was only when Sonia followed him to the end of the world and proved that she would not be pushed away from him that he melted and, quote, life replaced theory. A quote from one Dostoevsky scholar said, Raskolnikov's failure is not logical, but relational. His theory collapses only when he is no longer alone with it. So, if you feel like you're actually in a good spot already regarding living life rather than being stuck in theoretical isolation, maybe your task is to be like Sonia and look for someone who you can help replace theory with life. I've said so much already, and I feel like I haven't even covered everything I want to say on this topic, but you get the gist. If you feel the lack of life like I do sometimes, I'm sure you resonated enough hearing this that you will realize it. In which case, go touch some grass, go hug somebody, preferably someone you know, and go experience something good out there. It will chase the dark ideas away. And this is a big old wrap on Crime and Punishment. Man, this book took it out of me in a good way. I've enjoyed it so much, but it has been a bugger to get through, and I guarantee the next novel will be something much more chill so I can decompress a bit. But I'm Jameson Olson, and you've been listening to Becoming the Main Character. Protagonist listeners, I've got a handful of topics to dive into, so stick around. If you want the Protagonist edition of the show where you get extended episodes, character analyses episodes, and early access to what the next novel will be if you want to read along, link to that is in the description. But for the rest of you, thank you for tuning in. Go grab some life. We'll catch you on the next one.